Remember when I said that these videos were going to be relatively short? Well, that was honestly my intention, but intentions rarely meet with reality, hence the length of this video. Hello, and welcome. I hope you have a drink and a few snacks to accompany you through part 2 of my analysis of the Fellowship of the Ring. This video is going to cover the Shire section of the film in its entirety, going over concerning hobbits, the Shire, very old friends, a long-expected party, farewell dear Bilbo, keep it secret, keep it safe, the account of Isildur, at the Green Dragon, and the shadow of the past. This all adds up to approximately the next 37 minutes of the Fellowship of the Ring after we come out of the prologue. I was going to split this video in half, but I think it is simply cleaner and more coherent to cover all of the Shire stuff in one go. I hope you enjoy it. Before we get started, a very brief recap as to what actually happens. As we come out of the prologue, we join Bilbo Baggins in Bag End as he starts writing his book. He begins by delivering exposition about hobbits, which is broken up by Frodo Baggins greeting Gandalf the Grey as he arrives in Hobbiton. Gandalf arrives at Bag End and Bilbo tells him that he intends to leave. During Bilbo's 111th birthday party, Bilbo uses the ring to turn invisible, after which Gandalf insists that Bilbo leave the ring behind, which he reluctantly does before heading off on a very long holiday. Gandalf leaves shortly afterwards to confirm his suspicions about the ring, and when he returns, he informs Frodo that Bilbo's magic ring is in fact an evil doomsday device from 3,000 years ago, and that he has no choice but to leave the Shire with the ring, as Gollum has revealed the ring's location to the enemy. Frodo and his gardener Sam then embark on their quest. Much like the prologue, there is a huge amount of exposition in the Shire sequences, where we are introduced to no fewer than 6 major characters, tension regarding the ring is gradually built up, and we gain a comprehensive understanding as to the place of hobbits and the Shire within Middle-earth. This is a massive tonal shift when compared to the prologue, as we have jumped forwards by 3,000 years to a completely different part of the continent, and we are shown essentially a happy paradise land hidden away from the larger goings-on in Middle-earth.
And of course at this point the audience is introduced to the idea, look at that blue sky and the bright colours here, that each episode and the story has its own colour, and the colours here are bright and green and yellow and sunny.
When I first saw this, I just was like, isn't this just the place everybody wants to have grown up? I remember thinking, this is just such a beautifully safe and happy environment. Very much like New Zealand, I have to say.
The writers had a bunch of information that they wanted to deliver, and they justify it by having Bilbo deliver this information to us as he is writing his book. The book itself is not just a cheap one-time gimmick that exists purely to justify the exposition. It shows up multiple times in the trilogy, and it functions as a means of connecting the prologue to the present-day narrative. Bilbo's book, titled There and Back Again, covers the events of The Hobbit, of which Bilbo taking the ring from Gollum was a minor part. We don't get many specific references to Bilbo's history in The Lord of the Rings, but we do know that for some reason he was in a cave in the Misty Mountains. He is now writing a book called There and Back Again, which suggests that he went on some kind of adventure, and we get passing references to trolls being turned to stone, as well as the incident with the dragon. None of this is purely fan service, although it is also fan service, because in every reference to the Hobbit novel, as the films had of course not yet been made, we also get important character information or world building. Bilbo titling the chapter concerning hobbits is a reference to the prologue in the Lord of the Rings novel, which shares the same name, and both of them exist to deliver exposition to the audience. Where the book delivers this information from an objective perspective, that of Tolkien, the film delivers a condensed version from the perspective of Bilbo, which means we are able to gain an understanding of his character as he delivers what could otherwise feel like a history lesson.
I like the way in which, the hobbits and the society of Hobbiton and the essence of hobbits is set up, and we sort of were able to take the time to do that, whereas in the theatrical version of the film we had to sort of jump straight in it.
There are major differences between the theatrical and extended editions during the Shire sequence, and if you want a detailed breakdown on that topic, then oh boy do I have just the video for you. But for now, I want to briefly touch on these changes and why they happened. The theatrical edition entirely skips Bilbo's exposition about hobbits, and we cut straight to Frodo meeting Gandalf, which means the theatrical edition delays the introduction of Bilbo until Gandalf arrives at Bag End.
This sequence with Bilbo writing in his book in Bag End and describing the nature of hobbits was in a cut of the movie, but when the final decision was made to start the movie with a prologue, there was a feeling at the studio that perhaps to go from a prologue to Bilbo essentially narrating, the nature of hobbits in a book might be redundant in terms of an audience perception, that you were going from prologue to a sort of a hobbit prologue. Those two things bumping up against each other might get the movie off to an awkward start. That note was given to Peter, and although he loved a lot of that stuff with Bilbo and Ian Holm, he ultimately agreed that for purposes of the theatrical version, that perhaps it was best to just go from the prologue right into Frodo under the tree.
Once we decided to go back to the concept of including the prologue, and the prologue became 7 minutes long, this sequence started to feel like there was just too much narration. To some degree, that's probably true, but it is such a delightful sequence that I just felt that it deserved to be seen.
From the perspective of a first-time viewer, I would agree. Having so much exposition before we even meet the main characters could feel excessive. But we still get so much value out of a relatively short amount of extra footage.
I guess for the DVD, we put back scenes that are not necessarily required for the story, but scenes which add depth and character to it. I mean, that was the feeling generally. There's a lot of cool scenes that got left out just because they held up the narrative.
In the book, we do not meet Frodo until the party, which means this conversation Frodo has with Gandalf as they ride through the Shire is an expansion that was motivated by the fact that Frodo is the main character. This then allows for the writers to deliver further exposition about both hobbits and Bilbo, whilst establishing one of the most important character relationships in the film, that of Frodo and Gandalf. The brief reference to the incident with the dragon is used to depict Gandalf's cheeky sense of humour, as well as Frodo's intuition that Gandalf was more responsible for Bilbo's adventure than he claims. During the conversation, we get a bunch of character information that I will get to later, but there is also a very deliberate gradual tonal shift as it is hinted that there is something sinister going on with Bilbo. This is another factor that is absent in the theatrical edition, and I can understand why these references were removed, as this meant that Bilbo using the ring during the party was more shocking. Instead, the extended edition gives us Bilbo's freakout when he thinks that he has lost the ring, as well as Frodo's dialogue suggesting that Bilbo is acting strangely. And this heightens the tension, as the audience will be aware from information we received during the prologue that Bilbo has the One Ring, and it functions as a seed of evil in the paradise of the Shire.
I know one of the concerns that Fran had. She was worried that it would establish Bilbo as a slightly darker character. Bilbo is obviously a very lovable, cute hobbit, but the fact that we would first see him introduced in this way, being a little bit weird, acting in a slightly compulsive, unusual way, would lead to expectations of who Bilbo was that is not really true. That obviously he's just having a strange little episode here because of the way that this ring is affecting him, but he is basically obviously his usual lovable self. But it's possibly not the best way to introduce the character by seeing him in this manner first.
We didn't want to be too dark and too ominous too early because there's so much of that in the film.
After Gandalf arrives at Bag End, we get a prolonged conversation with Bilbo, which primarily serves to inform the audience of his intentions and his reasoning behind them. Gandalf looking at the map of the Lonely Mountain is not just, hey guys, remember the Hobbit? It is used to show how Bilbo is longing for another adventure, and that he wants to finish his book about his adventure. It hints as to Bilbo's intentions prior to them being made explicit, and although we have no idea what or where the Lonely Mountain is, unless we have read The Hobbit, it is clear that this was in some way related to Bilbo's adventure 60 years earlier. Bilbo claims that he wants to get away from the constant nagging of relatives so that he can finish his book. It is strongly implied, however, that there is more to this, as we already know that after Gollum found the ring, he took it into a cave for 500 years, and so there is an implicit suggestion that Bilbo will do a very similar thing, whether or not he intends to at this point. We already know that Bilbo likes to be alone. He is obsessive and he has some kind of emotional connection with the ring, so him disappearing and becoming consumed in precisely the same way that Gollum was is a natural progression from where we see him now. This scene also accomplishes something quite tricky. It needs to show us how the ring has changed Bilbo, but without ever showing us what Bilbo was like before he had the ring. We already had Frodo specifying that Bilbo had been acting more strangely than usual, and although he is a bit weird, he is nonetheless very friendly when he interacts with Gandalf. This means it is easy to intuit that he was more open with other hobbits when he was younger, and it gives us the first suggestion that the ring will amplify what is already there, as it does later with characters like Boromir. Bilbo is not depicted as a complete nutjob, but there is a very clear sense that something is not quite right.
The smoking scene is one that I thought I would have to fight for. I was sure at some stage, because it's Hollywood, somebody would come to me and say, you can't show smoking in a film, it's not politically correct. Yet it's my favourite scene, the smoke ship. I always wanted to have the smoke ship, and I was really gearing myself up for a hell of a fight when the day came that I was told to get rid of the smoking scene, but it never did. Nobody ever breathed a word about it.
Just before the party, we get a brief scene of Gandalf and Bilbo smoking, and Bilbo blows a smoke ring. Ordinarily, you could ignore this and be like, oh, okay, that's a smoke ring. That's something you can do when you smoke. But given that this film is called The Lord of the Rings, and given the importance a certain small circular object plays in the story, this smoke ring could be seen to symbolize the One Ring, which is currently in Bilbo's possession. Gandalf then blows a smoke ship through the ring, and the ship and the ring disappear. And this could be a reference to the ship that takes them to Valinor at the end of the story. As Valinor is used as a metaphor for heaven, this could be a subtle indication that Bilbo would be dying through natural means, if not for the presence of the ring. It could be referencing that the chaos and evil of the ring is going to be dealt with by Gandalf, as although he obviously has a lot of help from the other characters, the simple fact is that Gandalf is by far the most important character when it comes to setting in motion the plan to destroy the ring. And it could also be foreshadowing what actually happens. Bilbo and Gandalf both go on the ship to Valinor after the ring is destroyed. The party scene primarily functions as a calm before the storm, as this is the first scene where the power of the ring has an impact on the plot. This is where Bilbo pulls his magic trick before he intends to leave for good, and it is only as a result of Gandalf's caution that this doesn't happen. The party scene itself shows how Frodo fits in with the other hobbits, as until now we have only seen him interact with Gandalf. It sets up his dynamic with Sam, as well as establishing Sam's interest in Rosie. We get another reference to The Hobbit as Bilbo tells the troll story to the kids. Bilbo has probably already had a bit too much to drink, and comedy is drawn out of the fact that he is speaking to very young children about how the trolls were going to cook him and squash him into jelly. This also communicates that Bilbo is an excellent and enthusiastic storyteller, and it shows that he makes time for the kids despite not having any of his own. If we eject our own knowledge of The Hobbit, this story about the trolls sounds pretty wild, and so it is unclear as to how much embellishment Bilbo is adding. However, later in the film, the hobbits find these trolls that had been turned to stone, which reveals that this did indeed happen in at least approximately the way Bilbo described. Sam knowing about this also suggests that Bilbo's tale was well known, and Bilbo likely told anyone who would listen about that one time when he was nearly eaten by trolls. Yes, you could simply not include Bilbo telling the story and then also remove the stone trolls later in the film, but these help to add a sense of history without over-explaining any of it, which helps to ground the story of The Lord of the Rings as taking place in a world that has a past. This place did not suddenly pop into existence when the camera started rolling, and there is a clear sense that Frodo is treading in Bilbo's footsteps. All of these references to The Hobbit are so much more than, hey you, remember this other thing? They are used to build Bilbo's character and to imply a history that we otherwise never get to see. These references are also very brief and they are never the focus of the scene, aside from perhaps the mention of what happened with the trolls. Anyway, we are also introduced to Merry and Pippin. We get multiple brief moments of comedy from them as well as from Bilbo, and the party scene concludes with Bilbo blowing everyone's minds by turning invisible. After this, Bilbo immediately returns to his home as the partygoers lose their minds, and he fully intends to just pack up and leave without seeing anyone ever again, but Gandalf is onto him. This scene almost entirely consists of the argument between Gandalf and Bilbo, which I will cover in more detail later, during which Gandalf becomes increasingly worried about the nature of the ring, and the scene concludes with Bilbo heading on his way. After Bilbo leaves, Gandalf considers picking up the ring, and just before he does, we see a flash of the Eye of Sauron, and he ultimately decides not to touch it. This is entirely for the benefit of the audience, and Gandalf's decision to leave it on the floor where it was dropped is informed by his being extremely cautious, as we soon learn that he too is tempted by the ring, and only he understands the devastation that could bring. This is precisely why Gandalf never once touches the One Ring. He probably could just pick it up and put it in an envelope or something and be absolutely fine, but he principally refuses to touch it because he knows the stakes involved. This is different to the book, in which Gandalf directly interacts with the ring multiple times, and this small change helps to amplify both the threat and power of the ring, as well as Gandalf's fear of it corrupting him. When Frodo returns from the party looking for Bilbo, Gandalf reveals that Bilbo has gone, and that he too must leave because he has questions that need answers. Namely, what in the hell do I do now? How do I confirm my suspicions? Am I being too cautious? Are we royally fucked? Can I leave the ring with Frodo? Do I even have a choice?
All of them at once, I suppose.
During this sequence, Gandalf speaks cryptically about what he intends to do and what may or may not be going on, but this is not the writers forcing the character to be vague so as to manufacture drama. Gandalf has every reason to do this, because if what he suspects turns out to be true, then this could well mean that Sauron will return and the free peoples of Middle-earth are going to be wiped out or enslaved. The stakes are about as high as they can be, and stopping to explain this to Frodo unnecessarily would not only waste valuable time, but would also scare the shit out of Frodo. Gandalf needs Frodo to keep the ring, but he also cannot afford to explain what he suspects is the ring's true nature, so he chooses to keep Frodo blissfully unaware of what he has probably just placed in that envelope. This is the only choice Gandalf had, but even so, he is being selective with the truth and potentially putting Frodo in danger as a result, something that he deeply regrets as an unfortunate necessity. Next up, we get a significant contraction of the timeline as compared to the books, which I will go over in more detail later. For now, we transition from a shot of a confused Frodo holding the envelope containing the ring to a shot of Mount Doom, the place where the ring was forged, as the audience was told during the prologue. This is our first current year shot of Mordor, and we can see countless orcs and an unfathomably large tower. We also get a fake-out camera move, which is fucking brilliant. At first, the shot is of Mount Doom, which the audience is already familiar with, and so we are like, okay, the film is showing us Mount Doom. And off to the side, we can see what appears to be the top of an evil tower. The camera then pans down, and we can see that this tower is gigantic, but then the camera pans over the top of the tower, and it becomes clear that, oh, this was only one of the many spires on Barad-dûr, and the actual tower itself is many times higher. This is one of very few shots of Barad-dûr in the films, and this one only implies how tall it is, which means we do not yet see the Great Eye wreathed in flame. I have more to say about this ridiculously huge tower, but I'm going to save that for the next video so that I can discuss Barad-dûr and Orthanc together. The tension is then cranked even higher, as shortly after Frodo has been left alone with the ring, we hear Gollum's tortured cries, and we then see 9 black-clad horsemen ride out of Minas Morgul. The Fellowship of the Ring does not make this particularly clear, as the sequence seems to imply that they ride out of Barad-dûr, as there is no establishing shot of Minas Morgul. And Minas Morgul does not become a part of the story until the Return of the King, but this is not visually confusing because the audience can, incorrectly, assume that this is the same location and nothing actually changes. The point of this is, holy fuck nuggets, they're coming to get Frodo and they know where he lives, and Gandalf is not there to protect him. We then see Gandalf arriving at Minas Tirith, and there he discovers a means of confirming if Bilbo's ring is the One Ring.
We discussed whether we should actually title this as Gondor, and in the end we decided just to let it flow.
Yeah, we thought a lot about whether we
Yeah.
should throw subtitles up on the screen, to identify places, little captions sort of popping up, but we just thought at the end of the day it could be a little bit cheesy, and we decided not to do it. I think so long as people can follow the story, they don't need to know that this is Minas Tirith, that this is the ancient, the archives of the Citadel. I think the pictures at least tell you what's going on.
The reason Gandalf is at Minas Tirith is that he specifically needs to read the account of Isildur, and Isildur was the king of Gondor, so it makes sense that this account would be in Minas Tirith, and this account is the only document that could potentially contain any useful information about the One Ring. Sauron will not have written anything down, or if he did, there is no way that Gandalf could possibly get his hands on any such document, and the next bearer after Isildur was Gollum, who wasn't exactly the kind of guy to write down detailed notes about how it works and what it does. As Gandalf reads the account of Isildur, we can hear a choir entering as part of the score. This is not a specific theme, so I wanted to cover it now instead of when I cover the music later in the video. The choir sings in Quenya, which is an ancient elven language that is barely heard in the films. The words they sing are, please forgive my pronunciation, Ituo I Masil, Astaldaron Maori, Naikoma Masilia, Aleljat Turena, which translates as the strength, the weapon, the needs of the valiant. Be the ring your weapon, go to victory. This obviously applies to the ring corrupting Isildur, which is what Gandalf is reading about, but it may well also be referring to Gandalf's own temptation to use the ring for good. While all of this is going on, Frodo is enjoying a night at the pub with the lads. The extended edition fleshes this out into a complete scene, whilst the theatrical edition only shows him leaving the pub. This scene is useful from a world-building perspective, but it doesn't really advance the story in any way, although it does help to give the impression that Gandalf has been gone for more than 5 minutes.
Now, this is a scene that I really did regret cutting out of the theatrical version, and we did it only for momentum reasons. It's a chance to see the hobbits in their true essence, in their true environment before the adventure begins. It also uses these other hobbits to, with their typical kind of paranoid, suspicious, rumour-mongering. It's a hobbit trait that's very, very dominant in the books. And another aspect of the books that we found difficult to incorporate into the film, but this is the scene that we shot that sort of gives us that feeling that hobbits are gossipy and they love little stories and they're always suspicious about the outside world and all those kind of things that makes hobbits very cute.
But in the end, why it didn't survive in the theatrical cut was because there's only so much time you can take establishing Hobbiton before you really move your plot ahead, and we felt we were lingering there too long and it wasn't furthering the story for us, so it didn't stay.
It was ultimately removed because it was considered to be slowing the film down, which it does, but the content of the scene means that it is not simply filler. Next up is one of the most important scenes in the film. We open with what appears to be a POV shot from inside Bag End, watching Frodo as he arrives, which gives the sense that someone is inside the house and he is not safe. This is built upon when he enters and the house is both dark and the window appears to have been left open, which may or may not have been Frodo's doing. Almost immediately, he is grabbed by Gandalf in a truly effective jump scare because of everything else that was built up around it. It would be entirely plausible for this to be one of the riders in black, and Gandalf is clearly rattled, and so he did not announce himself to Frodo before scaring the shit out of him. This could be viewed as Gandalf deliberately doing a jump scare because he's a character in a movie, but if we think about this from Gandalf's perspective, he is not exactly in a good place. He strongly suspects that Bilbo's ring is the One Ring, and he now has a means of confirming this. If this is the One Ring, then he needs to be very worried because what the fuck is he supposed to do? He has returned to Bag End only to find that Frodo is not home, which means, more than likely, Frodo has left the One Ring unattended. Luckily, Frodo was only at the pub for a few hours rather than on some holiday in some other part of the Shire, because this meant that Gandalf was alone in Bag End with a desperate and practical need to locate the One Ring. This is very similar to what the writers do repeatedly with Boromir, but only really in the extended edition. They give him very good reasons for needing to recover the ring and return it to Gondor, and this desire to use it for good is twisted and amplified by the corruption of the ring itself, which causes him to do things that he would not otherwise do in the name of protecting his people. In this scene, Gandalf is in a very similar scenario. Both men have an understanding of the One Ring, and they know what may well happen if they take it. The difference is that the consequences of Gandalf taking the ring are much worse than if Boromir were to do so. However, this doesn't change the fact that Gandalf needs to find the ring so that he can confirm its true nature. This means Gandalf is given a very good reason to locate it, whilst being aware that he cannot allow this intense desire to overwhelm him. This means that when Gandalf returned to Bag End and found it empty, he presumably shut himself in one particular room and waited for Frodo to return, whilst trying desperately not to search for the ring himself. And this, plus the long weeks of travelling and hunting for Gollum, has evidently taken a toll on him, which is why he lurks in the shadows and grabs Frodo instead of being like, "Hello Frodo, I'm back, now about that ring." Gandalf then proceeds to give Frodo and the audience a bunch of information about the One Ring, and although this is heavy on exposition, it is vastly trimmed down when compared to the book, as the book also has Gandalf explain everything we already saw in the prologue, and much more. The writers have Gandalf deliver the information about Sauron, the Ring, Isildur, and Gollum to Frodo, but that all happens off-screen because we don't need to hear it a second time. And part of the reasoning for moving that information from here to the prologue is that this scene is already quite long and it is packed with information. And so including everything we got in the prologue would tank the pacing and overwhelm the audience with a sudden history lesson right when the ball needs to start moving. The earlier drafts, however, were much closer to the book, and all of the prologue information was delivered during this scene.
Do you remember, Pete, when we didn't have a prologue and all of the prologue information was in this scene?
Yeah, it really was longer. It was like about 3 times as long.
It was interminable.
We had all the flashbacks to the Last Alliance, didn't we?
Yeah.
All the flashbacks to Elrond and Isildur.
And
The
Ian
making
did
of the
about
ring.
he did about 7 pages of
That's right. Without the prologue, this was the scene that was
Of
going to have all
monologue.
that information.
Yes.
Yeah.
Frodo then asks clarifying questions, which allows the writers to explain a bit more about how things work. Frodo just learned that Sauron was destroyed, and so he questions how Sauron can still be a threat if he was destroyed, prompting Gandalf to respond that Sauron's spirit endured because he is bound to the ring. The film then presents a solution that seems to make sense before having Gandalf explain why that won't work, which means the writers are again using Frodo as a vessel for the audience. He is asking the questions we want to ask, and this allows the writers to explain how all of this works without having Gandalf be like, "Hello Frodo, as you know, the ring is trying to get back to its master," etc. And this is super important because if you don't clearly and naturally communicate this to the audience, then the stakes of the story will not be adequately set up, which will then lead to either confusion or a lack of immersion.
Well, this is critical stuff because everything that happens in this scene, if you don't grasp it successfully, which thankfully you do, nothing else really resonates for you the way it's supposed to. Peter and the editor, John Gilbert, they really did an elegant job finessing this whole section because in less deft hands, this whole sequence could have bogged down entirely and really destroyed momentum and pace, but it really gives you a lot of information in an entertaining and engaging way.
Frodo is like, okay, well, if Sauron can't ever find the ring, I'll just put it back in the box and not tell anyone. I kept it secret and safe while you were away, so I can just do that again, right? But unfortunately for Frodo, the answer is no. Because as we already know, and as Gandalf has discovered, Gollum revealed the ring's approximate location, and the Nazgul have been dispatched to retrieve it. When Frodo realizes this, we get another brief cutaway to the Nazgul approaching and killing a hobbit, making this the first and only time we see a hobbit killed in the films, excluding Gollum and Deagle, which ramps things up even further. The hobbits are defenseless and naive. They refer to the big firework man as a disturber of the peace, and now they are literally being cut down by evil wraiths rampaging through their home on a mission of murder and jewelry acquisition. This scene concretely establishes the stakes. Sauron is regaining his power and massing armies of orcs, and the only thing he needs to cover Middle-earth in darkness is the ring. This is the scene that tells us that Sauron must not get the ring. Frodo then tries to give the ring to Gandalf, believing this to be the obvious move.
This is one of those situations where you're trying to explain the most obvious thing to people. Well, why doesn't Frodo just give the ring to Gandalf? Why can't Gandalf just take it? It's those little bits of common sense that audiences always come up with that you've got to cover yourself when you're doing the movie.
Gandalf's refusal to take the ring results in them forming a plan, and the nature of the discussion keeps the pacing swift and the tension high. As soon as Frodo realizes that Sauron's forces know his name and where he lives, he is like, oh shit, I could die at pretty much any moment, and my personal view is that this is a substantial improvement when compared to the book. That isn't to say that Tolkien didn't have a reason for putting everything on hold for 17 years, because he did. The passing of years gives Gandalf the time he needs to fully confirm his suspicions. It allows for Gandalf and Aragorn to spend a substantial amount of time trying to find Gollum, and it allows for Frodo to age up by 17 years whilst looking as though he hasn't aged a day, which is further evidence as to the ring's true nature. However, there is just no way that was ever going to work in a movie.
17 years passed sleepily in the Shire.
Gandalf, it's really you. Oh, it's been so long.
17 years.
The film is like, Shire Baggins, the Nazgul are coming, oh fuck, they know where I live, we've got to get out of here. Whilst the book is like, Frodo, dear boy, you should probably leave soon. It has been 3 weeks since I told you about Sauron sending his evil minions to recover the ring. Okay, Gandalf, but counterpoint, what if I waited for 5 months instead?
What the fuck are you doing?
However, just to be clear, the filmmakers did not approach this from the perspective of the books are wrong and we can improve them. They approached this from the perspective of the books are incredible and we have a responsibility to do them justice, but certain things work better on paper than they do on screen. And so they were willing to make these kinds of changes.
The energy of the scene is like in deliberate contrast to the book as well, because the departure from Hobbiton is a very leisurely affair in the book, and we wanted to give the film a bit of heat, so that's why we deliberately kind of cranked it up through here to really try to light a fire under the story at this stage. Because one of the problems with adapting the book was always the fact of how you get a bit of momentum and heat under this opening section.
Well, they were well known, these big gaps of time, that there was 17 years between Gandalf's 2 visits and things like this to Bag End. We knew this, and yet we felt that was far too leisurely, and that Frodo takes his time. He's given his mission by Gandalf, and he takes another 6 months or whatever it is thinking about it. And it just, again, that tends to completely undermine any sense of dramatic urgency in the storytelling. So we couldn't honour that part of the book at all. We had to really compress and accelerate the time frames for the movie.
In the film, Frodo's departure is discussed and then executed in the space of a couple of minutes. He accepts what he must do, packs his things, and is told to travel out of the Shire and head to the Prancing Pony in Bree, where Gandalf will regroup with him. We don't yet know anything about Bree, but this dialogue communicates to us that it is not a part of the Shire, which means Frodo is travelling out of his home and into the unknown. The books have Gandalf leave Frodo in the Shire so that he can do some general investigation. The plan being that Gandalf will return in the next 5 months or so, after which they will take the ring to Rivendell. I am going down beyond the southern borders to get some news if I can. I have been idle longer than I should. He spoke lightly, but it seemed to Frodo that he looked rather worried. Has anything happened? He asked. Well, no, but I have heard something that has made me anxious and needs looking into. Frodo then does as instructed and waits, but after about 5 months, Gandalf does not return, so Frodo decides that he has to leave. He receives a letter from Gandalf when he arrives in Bree, but they do not reunite until Rivendell. Meanwhile, Gandalf receives a summons from Saruman delivered to him by Radagast. He accepts and is then betrayed by Saruman, hence his reason for not returning to the Shire. In the film, Gandalf and Frodo set out at the same time, which gives their mission a sense of urgency. Gandalf then splits off and goes specifically to visit Saruman to ask for advice, intending to reunite with Frodo in Bree. This doesn't happen because Saruman betrays Gandalf and holds him captive, and they only reunite in Rivendell. Anyway, they hear a noise and it is revealed that Sam has been eavesdropping, and so Gandalf decides to send Sam with Frodo. Gandalf asks Frodo for a second time,
"Is it safe?"
which contrasts with his line deliveries earlier.
"Keep it safe." "Is it safe?"
And tells us that he has somewhat gotten his shit together and is a little more at ease than he was. The Shire sequence ends with Frodo quoting Bilbo. It's a dangerous business going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. The first major bit of world building we receive is what hobbits are. Although pretty much everyone with a passing interest in fantasy will have some idea of what a hobbit is in the year 2026, this was not the case back in 2001. Whilst elves, dwarves, and orcs were common fantasy races, hobbits were not. Which means the writers needed to set up something almost entirely from the ground up. Tolkien based the Shire on Warwickshire and Worcestershire in England, where he grew up. And the culture we see in the film is broadly an approximation of a rural English village.
Hobbiton has a little bit of a kind of 18th century feel to it, while a lot of the environments and places that they visit later on in the course of the stories kind of go back further in time. Hobbiton feels a little bit more recent, and I think we were taking our cue there from Tolkien, the way that he described their artifacts and their way of life. It has a timeless feel, which is what we were really hoping for. I think my influence, as much as anything else, is the area that I live in England, Dartmoor in Devon, which is very hilly, very full of little kind of thatched cottages tucked away into little valleys, Everything looks as though it's kind of almost half grown out of the ground.
Hobbits seem to have a strong pub culture, as is often the case in these kinds of villages, and it shows that whilst, yes, they may value peace and quiet, that doesn't mean they don't enjoy a good drunken sing-along at the pub. Hobbits are shown to have some base level of technological intuition, as they are capable of stoneworking, woodworking, fabric working, agriculture, pottery, tobacco manufacture, excavation to build their houses, the brewing of alcohol, baking, and basic metalworking. Given that we know them to be a highly insular people, it can be presumed that the Hobbits did not outsource any of this, although that is a possibility. This means that the filmmakers and Tolkien are leaning on a real-world archetype to help the audience understand this fictional place and people. This is essentially a fantasy version of the pre-industrial English countryside. These people enjoy their lives and their home, and they just want to keep their heads down and get on with it. We learn that hobbits have been living in the Shire for hundreds of years, and they are happy to ignore the outside world. They don't care, and they want to be left alone. This is exemplified by Ted Sandyman saying, "Keep your nose out of trouble, and no trouble will come to you." This line exemplifies the worldview of hobbits perhaps better than any other, and it is swiftly revealed to be untrue. Whilst hobbits may have existed in the Shire for hundreds of years and kept to themselves without needing to concern themselves with anything that happens elsewhere, they can do this no longer. Even if not for the immediate presence of the One Ring, Sauron, Saruman, the goblins, whoever, are not just going to ignore the hobbits of the Shire just because the hobbits of the Shire ignore them. This isolationist worldview only works if you are not under threat. And because Frodo leaves in secret, this means that the entire time Frodo was away on his mission to destroy the ring, the hobbits were still drinking in the pub, gossiping about stuff they don't understand, blissfully unaware of the fact that Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin are currently risking their lives to try to save them from the encroaching evil so that they can continue living in ignorance. Other races are grouped together and referred to as the Big Folk, which presumably refers to anyone who isn't a hobbit, as although dwarves are not particularly big, they are substantially larger than hobbits. This implies that hobbits are the smallest sapient species in Middle-earth, and it makes clear that they are an insular culture who are not fond of outsiders. Bilbo believes there is no particular reason why any outsiders would come to the Shire due to how unimportant hobbits are, and this is why Gandalf sticks out so much. He is an anomaly amongst a tight-knit group of people who all seem to know each other. During the party, we see that Bilbo knows everyone's family names, and he doesn't leave anyone out. We are told that Bilbo invited half the Shire to his party, but that the other half are turning up anyway. This is likely hyperbole because the Shire itself is quite large, so Frodo presumably was just using a turn of phrase, but either way, the fact that a whole load of people are expected to show up who were not even invited indicates that the hobbits are a close familial community. There are no strangers, and if you behave strangely, as Bilbo often does, this will be noticed and talked about by everyone else. We learn that Middle-earth is full of strange creatures beyond count, which hints as to the scope of the story we are about to experience, whilst also implying something of Bilbo's own history. Bilbo contrasts hobbits with the strange creatures beyond count, which tells us that hobbits are not particularly strange. They are, in many ways, quite boring. There is nothing particularly special about them, and they do not stand out. In The Green Dragon, we hear a discussion about goblins, dwarves, and strange folk, but this is dismissed by some as nonsense. The hobbits simply do not know if goblins and trolls and the like are even real. They evidently hear stories about this kind of thing, presumably from travellers passing through or by trading with outsiders, but there is disagreement as to whether these stories are simply exaggerated children's fairy tales, or if there are indeed goblins and trolls in the mountains. Aside from Bilbo, none of the hobbits have ever encountered either, and so them disbelieving their existence is entirely understandable.
I always loved the Green Dragon sequence. It was a fun scene for me, and it also showed the friendship and the kind of awareness of somewhat of the outside world and how isolated these guys were. The people in the Green Dragon discount all these rumors and stories, and they have a great time there, and I actually loved that sequence.
Hobbits are not great warriors, nor are they particularly wise. They are therefore wholly unsuited for both combat and politics, which means the idea of a hobbit making any kind of impact on Middle-earth is unheard of. Hobbits have no particular worries in life beyond the occasional annoying relative, and they like to put their feet up and enjoy good food, ale, and pipeweed, as well as taking great joy in farming and growing plants. We also learn that hobbits have better hearing than humans, which they quite possibly evolved to help them stay out of trouble and away from danger. And this is indicated by Bilbo's ear twitch when he hears the Sackville Bagginses looking for him during the party, and we get this visual before we can hear them. The introduction of hobbits as a quaint, simple people who are happy to keep to themselves is a means of establishing a baseline understanding for Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings is a vast story in a hugely detailed setting, and through establishing that hobbits do not typically leave the Shire, this means that when they eventually do, they are fish out of water. This means that the audience learns about as much of the outside world as the hobbits do. They may have heard tales of the elves, they may have potentially been as far as Bree, but the four hobbits we follow in The Lord of the Rings are out of their comfort zone from the moment they leave the Shire. This gives the writers a means by which to deliver information to the audience, as both the hobbits and the audience will often have little idea as to where they are or what to expect. This also means that when the outside world comes to the Shire, as seen later with the Nazgul, as well as the general threat of what will happen to their home if Sauron wins, it feels that much more threatening because we have seen that the Shire is defenseless. They don't particularly like outsiders, even harmless outsiders in the form of that pesky wizard and his bloody fireworks, which means when the Nazgul eventually show up, the threat is absolute. One trap that Peter Jackson avoided in The Fellowship of the Ring that he unfortunately did not avoid in the Hobbit movies is that the Hobbits are depicted as incompetent, but this is not focused on or highlighted for the purposes of comedy. It is not exaggerated and turned into a big silly bit of slapstick. And so the Hobbits come across as endearing rather than as idiotic caricatures. We see one failing to move a pig and another failing to use a mallet after a group of them struggle to erect a tent. Instead of being cheap gags that pull us out of the movie by mocking the Hobbits, these can be explained entirely without saying, "Lol, aren't they dumb, isn't that funny?" The Hobbit failing to coerce a pig into following him shows us how Hobbits struggle with even the most basic tasks because they are so small, which reinforces their insignificance because nature itself doesn't particularly care about them. The group of Hobbits stumbling over themselves putting up the tent and failing to drive a stake into the ground merely shows that these Hobbits are almost certainly drunk, as we have just been told that they enjoy drinking ale and they are preparing for a party. This means we get a sense for how Hobbits are not particularly skilled at anything, but they generally get the job done after a few pints, and at no point does this sequence belittle or ridicule the Hobbits for being so quaint and simple. The audience needs to empathize with the Hobbits and their home for the story to work. We need to want to live in the Shire amongst these people, and to root for the Hobbits when their way of life is threatened. If the Hobbits come off as irritating clown people, then this will obviously fail. And because the film does not look down its nose at them, nor are they universally depicted as impossibly idealized caricatures, blissfully ignorant and all getting along perfectly fine, the Hobbits of the Shire feel real. There are disagreements, there is failure, there is suspicion of others, and this never feels like a hive mind of sock puppets intended to make the audience feel sympathy. They absolutely feel like a people that could exist. Bilbo's first lines inform us as to where and when, precisely, the story is taking place. We are not just in the Shire, we are in Bag End on Bagshot Row in Hobbiton, West Farthing, the Shire, Middle-earth. Unlike the storyboard prologue, I don't consider this noun overload because this is an address. We don't need to know that the road Bilbo lives on is called Bagshot Row, but this dialogue, combined with the visual of the map, communicates just how large the world is, and Bilbo's detailed reading of his own address contrasts with the battle we just saw on the slopes of Mount Doom. This emphasizes a core theme of the story, that the smallest things can make a difference. The world is incomprehensibly vast, whilst Bag End is tiny and insignificant, and the film communicates this during the brief transition out of the prologue and into the Shire. Had the film just stopped dead so that Bilbo could tell someone his address, then I would agree that that is not worth the time investment. But even though the extended versions of these films are rather long, The Fellowship of the Ring in particular does not waste time. It is tightly focused on the story of Frodo and the Ring. Bilbo also clarifies the year as 1400 by Shire reckoning, which again helps to imply a sense of scale and cultural isolation. The Hobbits are pretty sure of what year it is, but they don't adhere to any kind of calendar system being imposed on them by the outside world. This also tells us that the Hobbits document things, which is why Bilbo knows that there hasn't been a dragon in the Shire for 1,000 years. During the Green Dragon extended scene, we get other minor examples of world building that help to imply a sense of scale. We get our first mention of goblins, as they are apparently massing in the mountains, as well as dwarves who have been seen travelling through the Shire. There is also mention of unsavory people, which could be a reference to elves, the Nazgul, or men. Put simply, stuff is happening, and the Hobbits are hearing about it after the fact, without knowing or necessarily even caring about why stuff is happening. The hobbits are seeing the downstream effects of Sauron's movements, but they are unable to explain any of it beyond, oh, these are strange times, weird shit's going on, well, at least I have my beer. They speculate that war is brewing, which is accurate, but they land on this conclusion, seemingly by accident, as a result of a lack of information, paranoia, and a general dislike of the outside world. This opening Shire sequence gives us a massive amount of information about the One Ring and the effect it has on people. The first thing we see of the ring after the prologue is in the extended-only Bilbo freakout scene, where he panics, believing he has lost it. This tells us that he always keeps it on him, he can't bear to be without it, and it is causing him to become forgetful. When Bilbo finds the ring in his pocket, he holds it close to his mouth, almost as if he is kissing it, which clearly shows the deep emotional connection he has with it. When he does this, Bilbo also makes what could be described as an involuntary Gollum noise. When Gandalf and Bilbo meet, Gandalf remarks that Bilbo hasn't aged a day, which is in line with what we were told about the ring giving Gollum unnaturally long life, and it suggests that the same thing is starting to happen to Bilbo. Bilbo seems to think that his relatives have never forgiven him for living as long as he has, and whilst this is somewhat comedic, it speaks to Bilbo's paranoia that his relatives are waiting for him to die so that they can take his stuff. And this is likely made far worse as a result of the ring.
You know, this sense of Bilbo's paranoia, the fact that his relations are trying to get the house from under him is something that's very humorous in the book, so we wanted to have a sense of it in the movie.
Bilbo even plays with the ring in his pocket as he talks about how he feels old, and Gandalf notices this but dismisses it before Bilbo says that he needs a very long holiday. Perhaps a 500-year-long holiday in a cave. He describes feeling thin, like butter scraped over too much bread, which is a means of explaining how the ring is draining his spirit, despite the fact that he looks very good for his age. All of this sets up the power of the ring, and gives us buckets of tension by showing that Bilbo is already hooked, and suggesting that this lovable hobbit is going to end up like Gollum, and there is nothing he can do to stop it. It is easy to take all of this for granted, but what the writers accomplish throughout this opening 45 minutes or so is not at all easy, because essentially they needed to convey that this tiny ring is actually not made of gold, it is made of pure fucking evil. It contains part of the spirit of a Dark Lord who wants to take over the world, and so they needed the ring to give off both a passive aura of general spookiness and have the ability to directly influence the characters around it. The audience needs to fully accept that this inanimate piece of jewelry is an active participant in the story, and that it influences its surroundings in a non-physical manner. This is a form of spiritual corruption, a weakening of the soul, and successfully communicating this in a film without an over-reliance on clunky exposition is incredibly impressive. Bilbo seems to think that he put the ring in an envelope on the mantelpiece, and he then remembers that it is still in his pocket, which shows that the ring has a mind of its own, and it is seemingly moving around without Bilbo realizing, because it is causing him to forget where it is. Gandalf has no idea initially that this is the One Ring, but he does know that it is a magic ring of some kind. He is the only character present who is at all familiar with such magic rings, and he can clearly see the effect it is having on Bilbo. Where the hobbits see Bilbo as a wacky old man, Gandalf knows that there is something sinister going on even before he suspects the true nature of the ring. Gandalf's line about there being many magical rings explains why he is not immediately on DEFCON 1. It implies the scale of the world and speaks to Gandalf's experience within this world. Gandalf first becomes worried when Bilbo uses the ring, although he believes it to be a magical ring of the non-apocalyptic variety. This is why he innocently asks if Bilbo is going to leave the ring to Frodo, along with his other possessions. Gandalf is, at this point, fishing to see what kind of relationship Bilbo has with this ring. The ring then immediately starts influencing Bilbo to keep it when he is faced with parting with it for the first time. When the ring is influencing Bilbo, we get the extremely rare instance of a hobbit being filmed from a low angle, which exaggerates Bilbo's size in the frame, something that generally the filmmakers very consciously avoided, as this appears to work against their objective of convincing the audience that hobbits are really small. However, the reason for this low angle is that it conveys the power the ring is giving Bilbo. It wants him to feel like he is in charge. This angle also shows the ring as the object of Bilbo's focus, which highlights that although hobbits are small, the ring is even smaller, and even the smallest things can have the biggest impact. The ring wants Bilbo to keep it and to take it out of the Shire, as this will give it an opportunity to return to Sauron. The ring goes into turbo corruption mode when faced with a threat, and Bilbo's actions are by no means arbitrary. This isn't Bilbo deciding, actually, I quite like this ring, so I think I'll keep it. Nor is it the ring suggesting that Bilbo should go and hide in a cave for 500 years. This is the ring doing everything it can to make sure Bilbo does not leave it in Bag End. Rather interestingly, unbeknownst to all characters at this point, including the ring, Gollum has either already been captured by the enemy or he is about to be, which means very soon the Nazgul will be on their way to the Shire looking for Baggins. This means, had the ring done nothing and allowed Bilbo to leave it behind, it is entirely possible that the ring would have then been picked up by the Nazgul and returned to Sauron, but, of course, the ring did not know about Gollum being interrogated. Anyway, as soon as Bilbo starts to struggle with the idea of leaving the ring behind, Gandalf becomes very worried. He still doesn't know yet that this is the One Ring, because the idea of Bilbo fucking Baggins having the One Ring would be insane. As far as he is aware, the ring has been lost for 3,000 years after Isildur was killed in a river somewhere in Gondor, and the ring is presumed to have been swept out to sea. Gandalf then starts applying pressure on Bilbo for two reasons. Firstly, he doesn't want Bilbo to keep this ring, because it is evidently some kind of powerful magical device that he is using for, as he says, a bit of fun. And secondly, he wants to find out how badly Bilbo wants to keep it. Is he just like, no, fuck you, Gandalf, it's none of your business what I do with my stuff? Or is he in some sense ensnared by the nature of this ring? Essentially, Gandalf wants to know if Bilbo's reluctance to part with it is mundane or magical. Bilbo then becomes angry when Gandalf suggests that he part with it, and here I need to correct an error I made in the previous video. I claimed that Gandalf drew a connection between Bilbo and Gollum when he used the word precious, but Gandalf has not yet encountered Gollum, and so this can't be the case. Gandalf, therefore, must be referring to Isildur when he says that the ring had been called precious before, because he had presumably read Isildur's account of the One Ring previously. Regardless, Bilbo referring to it as his precious is what gives Gandalf the first indication that this may indeed be the One Ring, and however unlikely this may be, he now cannot allow Bilbo to leave with it. One question we can ask on a mechanical level is, why does the ring make you call it precious as opposed to beauty, shiny, treasure, or Carl? This communicates to us the effect that the ring has on everyone, but a potential problem is that it also communicates this to Gandalf, which, if mishandled, could give the impression that the ring influencing everyone to call it precious directly causes Gandalf to realize that this is the One Ring, which does not benefit the ring in the slightest. The writers should obviously avoid giving the impression that the ring is an idiot because it does things that it has no reason to do so that the plot can happen. It does not appear to benefit the ring to make everyone call it my precious, because this then means it is much harder to hide. However, the explanation for this is that the ring does not see Gandalf as a threat, which means it has no particular reason to conceal its identity. If Gandalf figures out that this is the One Ring and he takes it from Bilbo, then the ring gets what it wants, because it will have corrupted a goddamn wizard instead of an awkward goober hobbit. Therefore, the naming of the ring as my precious is not critical to the progression of the story, which means it is not lucky that Gandalf realizes that this is the One Ring. This means we can have the my precious link for the benefit of the audience without the plot relying on everyone happening to call it my precious. Anyway, Gandalf's line is specifically precious. It's been called that before, but not by you. Which means when he delivers this line, he is working under the assumption that this is the One Ring, even though he hasn't confirmed it yet. Bilbo calling it precious is when the stonks of this thing being the One Ring went from about 0.1% to about 75%. Bilbo becomes even angrier after Gandalf purports to know more about this ring than Bilbo does, given that Bilbo has possessed it for the last 60 years and has clearly become obsessed with it. He feels like he knows it quite well. Bilbo's heightened anger causes Gandalf to insist that Bilbo has had the ring long enough, because the more unhinged Bilbo becomes, the more concerned Gandalf is by the possibility that this is the One Ring. This is a huge contrast to how Bilbo has been portrayed until now. Although we have seen him being a bit weird and we have seen him angry, this is unhinged. This is Bilbo lashing out at his very old friend Gandalf, his guest, and telling him to stay the fuck out of his business. This discussion climaxes when Bilbo suggests that Gandalf wants the ring for himself, and this, of course, causes Gandalf to unambiguously end the argument. This is an invention of the films, as the books present a mildly heated discussion rather than... And so it is notable that Bilbo's frivolous assessment of Gandalf's intentions is what causes Gandalf to lose his temper. Bilbo is accusing Gandalf of lying and manipulating him for selfish reasons. Whether Bilbo genuinely, in a moment of ring-induced rage, believed that Gandalf wanted to take the ring from him is unknown. I would go with probably, given what happened with Smeagol and Deagle, but it is also possible that Bilbo was just chatting shit to get Gandalf to leave him alone. That old bastard wants to steal my magic ring, well, he can go fuck himself. And understandably, Gandalf does not respond well to being called a liar and a thief. But on top of that, if this is the One Ring, Gandalf is terrified of it. As he doesn't yet know for sure, he is extremely cautious of it. He knows what could happen if the ring were to ensnare him, and so what Bilbo is accusing him of is in fact the direct opposite of what he would want. It is precisely this temptation that he must avoid, because he is terrified of what would happen if he did take the ring for himself. After Bilbo is seemingly convinced by Gandalf that he must leave the ring to Frodo, he appears to forget where the ring is for a third time, but after Gandalf calls him out when Bilbo tries to just walk out of the door with the ring in his pocket, Bilbo's reaction suggests that he was trying to get one over on Gandalf and to simply leave with the ring and hope he wouldn't notice. Bilbo's reaction is one of a man who knows he has been caught in the act, rather than genuine surprise that he had forgotten where the ring was. This was presumably the ring trying to be clever, and when Bilbo agreed that the ring must go to Frodo, his mind had not actually been changed. He was simply telling Gandalf what he wanted to hear before attempting to take it with him.
I love the way that Peter places the ring as if the ring is a character in its own right. He uses the ring almost as if it's a two-shot.
The ring doesn't just fall, it almost adheres.
It almost sticks to the palm of his hand, and then it only reluctantly. And then when the ring lands, we wanted to put this big, heavy sound effect on, so it goes thump like it weighs a hell of a lot more than what it really should.
Also, when he drops the ring onto the floor, they had a magnetic floor, so the ring wouldn't bounce. As it hits the floor, it sticks by magnet.
This gives the ring a literal weight as well as a spiritual weight, and emphasizes its unnatural and overwhelming power. As soon as Bilbo drops the ring, he walks away from it as quickly as he can, before pausing and having a moment of clarity, whereby he seems to spontaneously think of an ending for his book. And he lived happily ever after to the end of his days, which suggests that the brain fog has finally been lifted, and Bilbo Baggins is now free. After Gandalf returns, having identified the ring, it begins to take a more prominent and characterful role in the story. It is inscribed with an unknown language, which is identified by Frodo, a layman, as some kind of Elvish. This is an interesting distinction that the films don't really have time to explore. The language itself is not any kind of Elvish, it is the Black speech of Mordor. Gandalf can speak it, but he refuses to do so in the Shire because in Middle-earth words have power, and there would be no reason for him to bring such darkness here unnecessarily. The reason why Frodo identifies the words as some kind of Elvish indicates that the lettering itself is Elvish, but the words are the Black speech. This is a means of showing that Sauron has perverted the Elvish alphabet by twisting it for his own ends, and this could also be seen as a form of mockery. We are then told that the ring has awoken after having heard Sauron's call, and it is shown to have a literal voice, as we hear faint whispering after Frodo says Sauron's name. This helps to give the ring a clear character, whilst also showing that part of Sauron is infused into the ring. Gandalf later tells Frodo that the ring wants to be found. Do not be fooled into thinking that this is just a piece of jewelry. You can't trust it, and it is going to work against you.
What we knew right from the word go was that the ring, as the source of evil, had to be somehow animated to almost become a character in the movie in and of itself.
You know, in the book, you can enter into the sort of psychological horror of the ring, and it doesn't need any, augmentation, but in a film, it's less easy to sell that. And so we knew that it needed some kind of literal voice in the movie. It needed to interact to some degree with the characters. So we thought long and hard about what kind of voice it would have. And ultimately, it's obviously Sauron's voice.
The ring in the script is very much a character. I mean, it has a force and a presence and an energy. In the script and in some of the big ring moments, it's described as sort of a humming that takes over the track. And then very early on, Peter started talking about the ring actually having a character, and that turned into the ring having an actual voice that would speak to people.
Part of why the formidable power of the ring is so effectively built up is that the writers use Gandalf to clearly establish the power scaling and the threat level. Gandalf is built up throughout the opening 30 minutes or so as competent, knowledgeable, and powerful, and yet he refuses to even touch the ring. He explicitly states that the ring is significantly more powerful than he is, as his intentions when wielding it would not matter. The ring would overwhelm him, his power would be twisted, and would cause unimaginable destruction. The final thing we learn about the ring here is that the agents of the Dark Lord are drawn to its power, which is something I will discuss in a future video when the agents of the Dark Lord are drawn to its power. As mentioned, Peter Jackson very much wanted to gradually crank the tension up throughout the Shire sequences, and this is accomplished by drip-feeding suggestions that something is wrong, infusing a sense of paranoia into multiple characters, and by giving the audience the foreknowledge as to what the One Ring is before any of the characters discover the truth. The first hint that something is wrong is when Frodo tells Gandalf that Bilbo is acting strangely, and we can guess that this is because the ring has altered Bilbo's behaviour. We see him obsessing over this ring. Gandalf notices Bilbo playing with something in his pocketses, and we already know why, which means there is a sense of dread rather than mystery, because the audience is one step ahead of Gandalf. Gandalf decides to intervene after Bilbo uses the ring at the party, and this leads into an increasingly intense argument, during which Bilbo acts like an unhinged lunatic. He speaks to both himself and the ring, and he appears startled and later furious that Gandalf interrupted his intense focus on the ring. After Gandalf makes the connection that there is even the slightest possibility that Bilbo's ring is the One Ring, he begins moving with purpose, and we get extreme close-ups of Gandalf, indicating that he is taking this deadly seriously, which contrasts with his sense of humour and carefree nature shown earlier. We then get a cutaway to Gollum being tortured in Barad-dûr, followed by the Black Riders leaving Minas Morgul, heading for Shire Baggins, and by the time Gandalf leaves Minas Tirith, we get a brief scene showing us that these Black Riders have already arrived in the Shire, and a terrified hobbit points them in the direction of Hobbiton. There might be some fucky editing going on here, but the suggestion is that the Ringwraiths are ahead of Gandalf, and so he may already be too late.
This was a scene that we shot after filming finished. It was a little pickup that we did because we felt we wanted to just show the riders on the borders of the Shire just getting closer, just to start to up the tension. We wanted to get a great voice. We were recording some Gollum dialogue and we said to Andy, do you want to try a Black Rider voice for us? And so Andy did it.
We don't need this, strictly speaking, but this is a means of showing that the potential threat has now become an actual threat. Sauron's spooky minions are not only looking for Frodo, but they know approximately where he lives and they are already in the Shire. This is a hugely effective means of maintaining a constant sense of tension by putting the audience on edge. And it means that when Gandalf eventually returns, we get an excuse for a fantastic jump scare. This is exactly the same principle that was used earlier with the ring. The audience knows more than the characters, so we are like, oh my god, Frodo, don't go in there. Gandalf's behavior when Frodo returns from the pub is no longer concern at a possibility. It is paranoia that he is too late. He is shown to be twitchy and jumping at shadows, and because we had the 2 brief cutaways to the Nazgul earlier, this means the film is giving the impression that 9 ringwraiths could just walk through the front door at any moment. This twitchiness happens multiple times. Gandalf is startled by a bird, and again by Sam under the window. Gandalf's final piece of dialogue to Frodo in this scene is to warn him that the enemy has many spies, including birds and beasts. And the first thing Frodo does after Gandalf rides off is get startled by a bird. This means that Frodo not only has to worry about the ring or other people trying to take the ring from him, but he cannot even trust the natural world around him, the world he has grown to love as a hobbit of the Shire. Every animal and every noise is a potential threat, and this, plus the dialing up of the agency of the ring, as well as the 9 ringwraiths closing in on Frodo's location, means that when Frodo and Sam are left in the woods by Gandalf, they truly feel vulnerable. They are not built for this, and their safety net has been forced to leave them alone once again.
The book is very different in this whole area, and in a way it was tricky to figure out how to get Bilbo on the road, how to make the ring stay behind with Frodo, what Gandalf's attitude was. The book is kind of vaguely similar, but very, very different, and we grappled with this. We basically wanted to make the film a little bit more tense, I guess, to keep the pressure on more so than in the book. And so we concentrated on making the ring and the threat of the ring foremost in the way that these scenes played themselves out.
In the books, Gandalf sticks around in the Shire for a week after Bilbo departs, and after Gandalf finally leaves, the story does not continue for 17 years.
Keep it secret. Keep it safe.
1 eternity later.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
During which Gandalf is doing stuff off-screen, whilst Frodo simply continues living his life as a hobbit, neither using nor really thinking about the ring. The hobbits hear rumours of strange goings-on in the outside world, including the unusual appearances of both elves and dwarves travelling near or through the Shire. Gandalf does reappear in the Shire during these 17 years to make sure Frodo and the ring are okay, but 9 years go by during which Gandalf's location is unknown. After he finally returns, he explains some of what he was doing, and this primarily involved confirming that the ring is the One Ring and hunting Gollum for further information.
This is actually a case where we changed the timeline in the book. I think from memory, 17 years goes past in the book from the time that Gandalf leaves to find out about the ring to the time that he arrives back. In our movie, we felt that 17 years was just too long a time, so we reduced it to seeming like a few months had gone by.
Well, for those who know the book, they'll know that there are fairly leisurely time frames in the Fellowship of the Ring, and this was not a luxury that we could indulge in the making of the film. We had to compress the time frames in order to get the story underway.
This is hugely condensed in the film for multiple reasons. Aging up almost every character by nearly 2 decades would have added needless complexity to what was already an incredibly complex production. Discovering that Bilbo's magic ring might be the One Ring and then putting the film on pause for 17 years whilst Gandalf confirms what the audience already knows is a fantastic way to kill the tension that had been gradually cranked in the opening chunk of the film. The film does not specify how much time actually passed while Gandalf was away, but we can make an educated guess. We know that he travelled on horseback to Minas Tirith, and he claims that he looked everywhere for Gollum, so enough time must have passed for this to happen. Minas Tirith is just over 1,000 miles from Bag End, so we're talking a couple of months for Gandalf to travel each way, plus however long he spends looking for Gollum. At a minimum, this could have maybe happened in 5 to 6 months or so, but it could have easily been longer. We also get some brief dialogue in the Green Dragon scene that implies that a reasonable amount of time has passed.
You're beginning to sound like that old Bilbo Baggins.
Which isn't how you would phrase this if Bilbo only disappeared a couple of days ago. We can also see when Gandalf returns that he is dirty and unkempt, the idea being that he had been sleeping uncomfortably on the road whilst trying to get back to Frodo as quickly as he could. The film does not spend any time clarifying this because it doesn't need to. It would negatively impact the pacing, and it would feel as though the writers are addressing a problem that doesn't actually exist. The only visual indicator that Gandalf was gone for longer than a few days is that we see him at Minas Tirith, and we can see that this is next to Mordor, which means we know from the map we saw earlier that Gandalf has travelled a great distance. The film otherwise gives the impression that he was gone for maybe a few days or a couple of weeks at most, because he tells Frodo to keep it secret and safe, Frodo goes to the pub, comes back home, and Gandalf is back. This is, however, not a plot hole, because the contraction of the timeline does not contradict anything. It just means that there is a time jump of at least a few months in between Gandalf saying goodbye to Frodo and Frodo drinking at the Green Dragon.
The exposition of the story so far is told very neatly in the book, and it's clear that there are a number of years past what in the film seem to be events that are following very closely on each other, but it could have been rather laughable that so much information is given so quickly. I think that was easily avoided because I, as Gandalf, and Elijah as Frodo, and Ian Holm as Bilbo, knew that what we were talking about was very, very important, not just for our characters, but for all the characters who inhabit Middle-earth. So once you say it's the future of the world which is at stake, what seems on the face of the script to be simple exposition turns out to be a matter of life and death.
Aside from travelling to Minas Tirith, Gandalf also enlisted Aragorn to hunt for Gollum, although this is never stated in the films. Aragorn managed to locate Gollum over a period of many months or years, and brought him to Gandalf. Gandalf then learned that, prior to being captured by Aragorn, Gollum had been imprisoned in Barad-dûr, and he had already revealed the location of the ring. Gandalf then returned to Bag End, hoping to arrive before the agents of Sauron, and this is why Frodo is forced to leave his home and take the ring with him. Again, in the books, this all happens much slower, and for pacing as well as tension reasons, this was accelerated for the films. It will be interesting to see how this is adapted in the upcoming Hunt for Gollum movies, as that story takes place entirely during the 17-year time jump that is massively condensed for these films, and yet the Hunt for Gollum is intended to be canonical with these films. I am unsure exactly how that is going to work, because whilst Hunt for Gollum would not break The Lord of the Rings on a plot mechanics level if it revealed that Gandalf was indeed gone for 17 years, it would create an inconsistency, which is that every character enters cryosleep for 17 years, and therefore does not age a day. The casting in The Lord of the Rings is great to the degree that it is difficult to find a weak link. If you were to ask me to recast one particular role, I don't have an easy answer as to who that would be. Because in many cases, the performances in these films are some of the actors' best work, and that is particularly impressive given the relatively short amount of screen time some of the characters had, plus the fact that many of them had been acting for 40 years, if not longer. One example is, of course, Ian Holm, who was the first and only choice for Bilbo Baggins.
Working with Ian Holm on this couple of days, whether we were together or not, was two of the happiest days of my professional life. I've been an admirer of his since I saw him play Henry V at Stratford-upon-Avon when we were both young. I certainly marked him down as the greatest actor of his generation on stage. Against all the odds, you know, a noticeably small man, and these things matter in the theatre, but his inner strength was so huge that his physicality was irrelevant. I think this is one of Ian Holm's great film performances, you know. It's a very daring performance. It risks being thought to be too melodramatic in that he shows an awful lot on his face. It's a very, very generous way of acting, and takes enormous risks, of course, because you risk making a fool of yourself. I'm a little bit more careful.
Bilbo is essentially the main character for this early part of the film, and the reason for this is that Bilbo is currently in possession of the One Ring, which means we are still following the ring even though the prologue has finished. Once it passes to Frodo, it remains with Frodo for the rest of the film, and aside from a handful of brief scenes at Isengard, the entire movie sticks with Frodo and the ring. Bilbo is characterized very efficiently in the extended edition, where we receive a lot of character work for him as he gives us exposition about hobbits. It is made clear that Bilbo is a cheeky fucker, as he describes his own people as not to be counted among the very wise. He clearly finds himself amusing as he laughs at his own wittiness when writing, and again after he successfully blows everyone's minds by turning invisible. During this exposition, he is interrupted multiple times and he becomes increasingly agitated. We go from "Frodo, get the door" to "Frodo, where the hell are you?" At some point he puts up a sign saying no entry, but even this doesn't appear to work, and he shouts, "Piss off, I don't want any more well-wishers or distant relations," before realizing that he is speaking to Gandalf. This irritation with his relatives climaxes when the Sackville Bagginses return to knock on the door after Gandalf arrives, which causes Bilbo to have a mini freakout, and all of this is used to inform his decision to leave his home. This is great because it means we are not just hinging Bilbo's decision to leave on something magical corruption or whatever. Bilbo is instead somewhat understandably pissed off with his relatives, and the ring of course exacerbates this and makes him respond in a slightly more extreme manner than he otherwise would. One reason why the concerning Hobbit sequence was removed for the theatrical release is because the writers were concerned that Bilbo would come across as a weird, dark, and evil character. And although this forms elements of his characterization, they figured bringing this in as his introduction would give the audience a false impression of what to expect. I disagree, because although Bilbo's mini freakout is a tonal departure from the rest of the early Shire material, that is the whole point. It contrasts Bilbo's exposition about the whimsical, carefree nature of hobbits with "oh shit, this poor bastard has a hellish doomsday device in his pocket." We know anyway in the theatrical edition that Bilbo has the One Ring, which means the tension and the potential for evil to find its way into Hobbiton is already present regardless of whether or not you cut the freakout scene. Anyway, Bilbo longing for adventure is, in fact, the first piece of information we get for him in the Shire sequence, as the first thing we see in the Shire is Bilbo's map laid out on a table, and this specifically indicates that he is intending to retread his adventure from 60 years prior. But even without knowledge of the Hobbit, this suggests that he is dreaming of being somewhere else. Bilbo is not particularly well liked by the other hobbits. They consider him strange and abnormal, and this is apparently as a result of the adventure Gandalf whisked him away on decades prior, and it might also have something to do with a certain magical ring he brought back with him. He is depicted as a recluse, and he appears to be a bit of a hoarder. He is untidy and obsessive, and he likes to be alone. His home, lovely though it is a mess. He is clearly overstimulated, and his approach to cleanliness is one of organized chaos. Bilbo likely knows where everything is, but to an outsider, this looks like a guy who is losing his mind. He is hyper-focused on his writing to the point where he doesn't even realize that Frodo is not in the house. Bilbo is repeatedly shown to avoid confrontation, and he often struggles to communicate. Whilst he will happily interact with the other hobbits, provided he knows in advance why they are there, he does not like unannounced guests, hence the sign on the gate. He expects Frodo to answer the door, even though this is his house and his upcoming party. He avoids the knocks at the door, he intends to get away from the people he dislikes, he flees from his relatives during the party, he can't bring himself to actually say goodbye to Frodo, and he intends to simply disappear after the party without a word. He doesn't actually say goodbye to Frodo until the last possible moment, when he looks directly at Frodo as he closes up his speech and turns invisible. Bilbo clearly does not like having difficult conversations, nor does he like having to explain himself, finding it much easier to write things down than to say them. Although his speech at the party starts off okay, it quickly becomes awkward, and the only reason he caved in and gave a speech to begin with was likely because he saw it as the perfect opportunity to turn invisible in front of everyone and blow their fragile little minds. Rather interestingly, Bilbo tells us that hobbits highly value peace and quiet, and he says this even though he knows this is not entirely true of himself. He knows he is abnormal amongst hobbits, as is Frodo, but to a slightly lesser degree. Bilbo only speaks to Frodo during the party after Gandalf reminds him that it would be a bit of a dick move to just disappear without saying anything. He claims that the reason he adopted Frodo was because Frodo showed real spirit, which suggests that he saw himself in Frodo. And if this is true, then, as Bilbo says, this was done for selfish reasons rather than to give Frodo the best life. Bilbo generally dislikes his relatives, but Frodo is the exception. He is proud of hobbits in general, despite recognizing that hobbits are small and insignificant, as he half-jokingly clarifies that hobbits are not just interested in food, they are also skilled at brewing ale and smoking and presumably manufacturing pipeweed. Bilbo is particularly proud of Frodo, praising Frodo's intuition when he works out that Bilbo intends to leave, considering it obvious that Frodo would suspect something. Bilbo is, however, shown to be a very accommodating host, and he is extremely friendly with people that he likes. He gets carried away preparing food and drink for Gandalf when he arrives, before even asking Gandalf if he wants anything to eat, to the point where he is running around in the back of his house talking to himself, while Gandalf, his dear friend that he hasn't seen in years, is left to wander around on his own. His dialogue is difficult to hear because the focus is on Gandalf and Bilbo is in the background, but he essentially says, "Sorry Gandalf, you caught me unprepared," and he then proceeds to cobble together a meal out of bits and pieces he had lying around the house. He decides against feeding Gandalf some cheese that he had evidently left on the windowsill. He says he might have some apple tart, but he can't find any custard, and he then finds some sponge cake before offering Gandalf some eggs, which Gandalf rejects. This is obviously all over the fucking place. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to what the hell Bilbo is doing. And this all takes place in the background because the focus of this part of the scene is on Gandalf entering the house, bumping his head, and looking at the map showing the Lonely Mountain. But within this scene, we get a huge amount of information for Bilbo, as until now we have only seen him writing his book, and we have received exposition about him from Frodo. Gandalf is now in Bilbo's home, and he experiences a concentrated jugular shot of a hyperactive Bilbo just as we do. Bilbo had invited Gandalf to the party, and this is why Frodo told him that he was late. Gandalf knew that the party would be special, and he is implied to have some foreknowledge of Bilbo's plan prior to meeting with Frodo. And yet, Bilbo evidently lost track of time, which is why he didn't clean the place up, nor did he prepare any food beforehand. He was so wrapped up in writing his book that he misplaced both a plate of cheese and his custard, and it appears to have slipped his mind that Gandalf was even coming. This shows us in the background of a brief sequence that is not focused on Bilbo, the extent to which he is uncomfortable where he is. And it suggests that his erratic nature may be exacerbated by a certain evil magical ring. His mind appears to work too quickly, which causes him to be impulsive and not particularly polite, as when Gandalf turns down the offer of food, Bilbo stuffs a load of cold chicken into his mouth and asks, with his mouth full, if Gandalf minds if he has something to eat. Bilbo is not living a particularly healthy lifestyle, which contrasts with his apparent youth despite being 111 years old. We are told that he looks remarkably good for his age, but it is implied that Bilbo isn't eating proper meals. He is snacking on cheese and chicken. He leaves it lying around the house and presumably finishes it off when he gets hungry. He has eggs, but he seems to consider this a lower priority than wine when he offers them to Gandalf, and this could all be a deliberate choice to indicate that Bilbo is not just 111 years old and looking 60, but he is an unhealthy 111 years old and looking 60. Bilbo clearly has a very good memory, as there are a lot of people at the party and he appears to remember everyone's names. However, he also forgets where the ring is before finding it in his pocket, and he later seems to genuinely think that he put the ring in an envelope on the mantelpiece, and then remembers it is again still in his pocket. Bilbo then seems to forget a third time, but the film implies that this was deliberate. This is notably different to the books, which seem to portray Bilbo trying to leave with the ring as a genuine mistake rather than any kind of deception. The film plays up Bilbo's trickery, which suggests that the ring still has a level of control over him, even after Gandalf scared the shit out of him.
It's my first opportunity to play with Ian McKellen, whom I've met, but I've never actually worked. I mean, people automatically assume that, you know everybody in Britain. But we've never worked together. And that has been a tremendous joy for me, because he's the most generous of actors. And he works in a way that I like, which is a sort of ensemble way of thinking. In other words, he's not frightened of suggesting things to me and vice versa. And that way, we can combine and work out a scene together.
Ian is a master actor. He has a technique or an approach to film acting which hadn't occurred to me before, in that each time he spoke the lines, it was a slightly different Bilbo that I was working with and reacting to. Because Ian's approach is to willfully make each take different. And so he provided what he called a kaleidoscope of Bilbo for Peter Jackson to eventually look through and shake into whatever configuration he wanted.
It is implied a few times that Bilbo had been planning the exact manner in which he would depart for quite a while. Gandalf clearly knew something beforehand, and he tells Gandalf that this will be a night to remember. Bilbo has been planning to go out with a bang to leave people speculating as to what happened to him for years to come. He says this after seeing Gandalf's magic smoke ring ship thingy, which reminds him of his own far more impressive magic trick that he intends to pull later that evening. It is suggested that Bilbo had made arrangements for after he leaves. Presumably he had sorted legal documents leaving his belongings and Bag End to Frodo to ensure that the Sackville Bagginses don't swoop in and try to claim ownership. Bilbo does not simply grab his bag and leave. This had all been planned for a while, and he is handling his departure in a somewhat responsible manner, in spite of this all being influenced by the ring. When he starts giving his speech, Bilbo delivers the iconic line, "I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve."
One more time?
This is a tangled line of dialogue, and Bilbo seems to intend for it to be a joke, as the lack of laughter afterwards throws him off and causes him to stumble and find comfort in the ring. The hobbits are not sure if they have just been insulted, which is why they don't laugh, which suggests that Bilbo is too smart for his own good. Bilbo is saying, approximately, that he regrets not getting to know many of them better. "I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve" also suggests that he believes he has been a bad neighbor, as he has been the weird loner sitting in his house writing books when he could have been socializing. He can't just come right out and say this because Bilbo demonstrably has trouble communicating, and so he instead disguises this honest declaration of regret inside of a complicated riddle/joke that is deliberately difficult to understand. He is shown to be sweating buckets as he says goodbye, and the manner in which he bids farewell to the hobbits is particularly awkward.
I regret to announce this is the end. I'm going now. I bid you all a very fond farewell.
The words themselves are not inappropriate, but the way Bilbo says them comes across as nervous and scared, as if he is being forced to do something that he really doesn't want to do. This plays as though the ring is standing next to him with a gun to his head, telling Bilbo to convince everyone that he is going to leave.
We added a little bit of psychological intensity to this that's not really in the book. In the book, the disappearance of Bilbo is like a total lark, a real trick he plays, and we just wanted to show that the ring is actually having a little bit more of a potent effect on Bilbo, and it's starting to make him look a little odd.
However, in spite of his awkwardness and strange reclusive behavior, Bilbo Baggins is fundamentally an entertainer. He likes to give people something to talk about and to inspire a sense of wonder. He enjoys regaling his adventures to the kids, and although he intends to quite literally just disappear, he wants his adventure and his departure to be remembered and to be discussed in the years to come.
I was lucky not to be basically using my own voice and my own accent. You forget, don't you, that Elijah Wood is not. He's always speaking with a foreign accent, effortlessly.
In this opening chunk of the film, we do not learn a huge amount about Frodo, and he does not become the focus until after Bilbo leaves. However, it is made clear multiple times that Bilbo is going to leave, which suggests to the audience that Frodo will then become the focus, because if The Lord of the Rings was a story about Gandalf the wizard trying to solve the problem of the evil magic ring, then Frodo being given any real focus as a character would make little sense. Frodo is referred to by Bilbo as a boy, and he is substantially younger in the film than in the book, which portrays him as sharing Bilbo's birthday, another piece that was simplified, and turning 33 on the same day that Bilbo turns 111. 17 years pass before Frodo embarks on his quest, and so in the books he is 50 years old by the time he leaves Hobbiton, although his ownership of the ring prevented him from visibly aging past 33. Because this time jump is not in the film, and because Frodo's 33rd birthday is never mentioned, this meant Frodo could be portrayed by a much younger actor, and the filmmakers chose the 18-year-old Elijah Wood, who was the first actor to be cast.
Elijah Wood had heard about the project from his agent at William Morris, and knew that Peter and Fran were really casting for really British boys. That's what they wanted. They wanted the four Hobbits to be played by Brits. And he knew if he wanted to be in the running that he'd have to do something dramatic. And so he put himself on tape. He auditioned himself, reading passages from the book, and mailed the tape in to Peter and Fran. And as a result of what they saw, he immediately came into the running. Peter and Fran, everyone would look at dozens, if not hundreds of people for roles. At New Line, we would only get the finalists. And when that tape came in, there was no dispute. You didn't even have to look at anyone else. I mean, it was so clearly and instantly apparent that Elijah Wood would play that role. There was just no debate.
This decision was made for a few reasons. A younger character going out into the world for the first time is more relatable and emotionally compelling than a 50-year-old man doing the same. His youth emphasizes his innocence and vulnerability by contrasting his appearance with that of the older actors in the film. And this also allowed the film to portray Frodo as being of approximately the same age as Sam, Merry, and Pippin, instead of being 15 years their senior, which would have a completely different dynamic that was deemed undesirable for the film. Although this is never mentioned in the films, the books tell us that hobbits come of age when they turn 33. Which suggests that they age and mature at a slower rate than humans, which means it is entirely possible that Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin are all around 33 years old in the films despite looking much younger. But either way, I think these were all wise changes that prioritized visual readability and avoided unnecessary exposition. Frodo is shown to be emotionally intelligent as he jumps off the cart before Gandalf arrives at Bag End, suggesting that he wants to give Gandalf and Bilbo time to themselves. He knows that they haven't seen each other for a long time, and that Gandalf is here to see Bilbo, not him. This also implies that Frodo is a character with his own life and his own friends, and so he simply does not need to be following Gandalf and Bilbo around the entire time. We later see that he enjoys socializing at the pub, including drinking, singing, and gossiping, and he is described as cracking, showing that he is liked by the locals. Frodo does not have the same negative stigma that Bilbo has, or at least not universally. He is seen as a good lad with a weird uncle. Frodo does have elements of his Uncle Bilbo in that he is a bit abnormal for a hobbit. He is more than happy to enjoy his own company, but he is certainly far less of a recluse. He evidently knew that Gandalf had been invited to the party, and so he deliberately went to chill by the road and wait for him. The film makes it clear that Frodo had met Gandalf previously, although they have not seen each other for many years. His first line of dialogue does so much to help build an implied relationship between himself and Gandalf. He says, "You're late to a wizard," which shows both that he knew Gandalf was coming and planned to meet him, as well as suggesting that Frodo has some balls to speak to a wizard like this, which helps to establish that Frodo knows Gandalf well enough to where he can confidently make accusations like this without worrying about being turned into a chicken. Frodo is shown to be intuitive and intelligent. He has noticed Bilbo's strange behavior, and he has a pretty good idea of what Bilbo would like to do, although he never believed Bilbo would actually leave until after he was gone. He is slightly worried about Bilbo, but the writers are careful, and they never give Frodo a reason to take this particularly seriously, as he might if he kept finding Bilbo staring unblinking at the ring for hours at a time. Bilbo's generally strange behavior gives Frodo a reason to somewhat dismiss his concerns regarding Bilbo's current strange behavior, and the reason he even mentions this to Gandalf is to satisfy his own curiosity. Frodo is fishing for information regarding Bilbo's intentions. He thinks Bilbo intends to leave at some point, but he doesn't know any more than that. He doesn't know when he will leave or where he will go. He doesn't know exactly why Bilbo is leaving, nor does he know what Bilbo will do with all of his belongings, and so he understandably asks Gandalf for more information. One minor change from the book is that Frodo only suspects that Bilbo might be intending to leave at some point, whilst in the book, Frodo was in on Bilbo's plan, including that Bilbo had a magical ring that turned him invisible. The reason this was changed was likely to build a sense of mystery and tension, and to make it slightly more shocking when Bilbo does eventually leave. The film is not explicit as to whether or not Frodo knew that Bilbo had a ring, or if he knew that it was magical, until he disappeared. And this was done to streamline the film and to avoid over-explaining something that doesn't particularly matter. Although the film seems to imply that Frodo, at the very least, knew that Bilbo had a ring that he valued. We can read Frodo's response as unsurprised that Bilbo has literally just turned invisible, but disappointed that he has chosen to leave, or we can read it as his mind being blown because he has no idea what he just saw. In the book, Frodo hoped that Bilbo was only joking, but he knew the specifics as to what Bilbo planned to do. Changing this allows Bilbo's departure to seem darker and more sinister than in the book, as the film shows that Bilbo was tricking Frodo as well as everyone else. After Bilbo leaves, Frodo becomes more of a focus because the ring has now passed to him. He is primarily used in these scenes as a means of receiving exposition from Gandalf. He is the audience surrogate during much of the film, and he asks clarifying questions to ensure that both he and the audience understand the stakes of the narrative. However, it is also made very clear that Frodo has a great sense of responsibility. He quickly realizes that he has no choice but to set out on his own adventure so as to get the ring and himself to relative safety. He is pushed into doing this because if he stays where he is, then the ring will be taken and he will almost certainly be killed. But the way this is portrayed is that Frodo comes to the realization that this is all on him, and he then accepts this responsibility without Gandalf telling him. This is a great example of not babying your audience. Gandalf does not say, "Frodo, you have to take the ring because I can't." He instead says, "I can't take the ring, and it can't stay in the Shire." This leaves only one option that need not be stated. Frodo is an excellent character, and I don't quite understand why some people highlight him as a weak point in the films. He is efficiently set up, and at this point he is a far more simplistic character than either Bilbo or Gandalf, but he has only really been an active participant in the story for about 8 minutes by this point, most of which was exposition, and so we haven't had much of an opportunity to dive into the nuances of his character. But thankfully, there is still like 10 hours of film to go, during which Frodo goes on a bit of a roller coaster. Gandalf is perhaps the single most important character in the Fellowship of the Ring, and Ian McKellen's performance as Gandalf is nothing short of legendary. And this is in spite of the fact that Ian McKellen had not read the books at the time when he accepted the role. This iconic performance almost didn't happen, as McKellen initially declined due to conflicts with filming the first X-Men movie, and the role was offered to and turned down by Sean Connery, Patrick Stewart, and Christopher Plummer.
I imagine this is just a ceremonial position. They don't actually expect me to do any fighting, does it?
Personally, I think you're a fucking idiot.
You haven't aged a day. I envy your youth!
Make you some eggs if you love.
I loved food.
Whoa! Things just got real.
Losers always whine about their best.
Winners go home and fuck the prom queen.
Gustav.
Go away or I kill you!
All has turned to vain ambition. Guards, kill him!
I am near death.
Ah, there's a pulse. You bitch! I'm gonna sue the living... Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go party my nose clean off my face.
When Ian arrived in New Zealand, I showed him a videotape I had with some interviews with Tolkien, and then obviously he got some of those audio tapes that you can get. And Ian based his performance of Gandalf on Tolkien. I mean, he was impersonating Tolkien.
It was looking at myself in the mirror as Gandalf, adjusting the stoop of the shoulders, and in doing that, feeling the voice deepen and getting raspier and a little more precise than perhaps my own is.
And really, in a sense, Tolkien does have a part in our movie, interpreted through Ian McKellen's performance of Gandalf.
I thought of a man who smoked a bit too much, so there was a little rasp in the voice, and he was of a certain age, of course, and the voice does get a bit tired. I thought it right that he should have a received English pronunciation, because probably like Tolkien, he was of that middle class that would speak in that sort of voice, cultured voice, an Oxford voice. I wanted him to sound a little bit old-fashioned, a little bit careful with the way he spoke.
Gandalf is used throughout the movie to deliver a massive amount of exposition, but through how he delivers the exposition, we also learn so much about his character. This is not a case of Gandalf simply being a mouthpiece for the writers. They are just as much using the delivery of the exposition to inform us about Gandalf, thus accomplishing multiple things at once. He is seen to be somewhat modest, riding a single horse and cart and wearing grey robes. Everything about him is understated, and aside from him being physically larger than the hobbits, there is nothing particularly special about him. However, the dialogue immediately tells us that he is a wizard, which sounds obvious given his appearance, but if you go into the film knowing nothing, you kind of do need to know that Gandalf is a wizard straight away. And both the dialogue and the performance communicate to the audience that this wizard is a vast ocean of experience and knowledge. The relationship Gandalf has with both Frodo and Bilbo is so effectively established that it is difficult to emphasize just how good this is. The writers needed to communicate in like 2 or 3 lines of dialogue that they know each other very well, imply a history that then reinforces certain decisions that they make later, and perhaps most importantly, make the audience care about all 3 characters and believe that they care about each other. This is something that inferior writers fail at despite having infinitely more time and resources available to them. And this failure is why many films and TV shows can feel like you are watching action figures quip at each other, rather than experiencing a genuine relationship between real people who exist in a time and place. Gandalf's first line is, of course,
"A wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to."
This tells us that Gandalf is a wizard, that Frodo knew Gandalf had been invited and was waiting for him, that Gandalf has arrived later than Frodo was expecting, and that Gandalf has a playful sense of humour and finds it amusing to pretend to be mildly displeased. Gandalf deliberately messes with people frequently, and he uses the threat of his power in a slightly tongue-in-cheek manner to either amuse himself or to coerce others.
"He arrives precisely when he means to." I might have known. Bilbo Baggins!
Don't turn me into anything unnatural.
The impression given is that Gandalf could, if he was so inclined, do pretty much whatever he wanted to the hobbits. They are not only a non-magical race, but they are also tiny and rather gullible, and they can't even begin to comprehend what Gandalf is capable of. The writers, and Gandalf himself, use this fear of the unknown to their advantage, as it both helps to build a sense that Gandalf is extremely powerful, but also that Gandalf is willing to just let the hobbits believe whatever they want to believe, without confirming what he can and can't do. This is very useful with regard to tension. For example, in Gandalf's opening scene, we don't yet know what his relationship with Frodo actually is, and so Gandalf responding to Frodo's accusation with, "I'm not late, I'm here when I meant to arrive," could be read as him being like, "Boy, shut the fuck up and don't tell me what to do." But once they both start laughing, this tells us that they know each other very well, and Frodo was simply going along with Gandalf's joke. He again leverages the fear of his magical powers to coerce Sam into doing what he wants, Although in this case, Sam is Frodo's employee, and so this is not just Gandalf scaring the shit out of him and telling him to go on an adventure with Frodo. He is, however, genuinely pissed off with Sam because Sam scared him, which is something that would never normally happen, but given the recent elevation of the stakes, Gandalf is super jumpy right about now, and the last thing he needs is some idiot gardener giving him a heart attack. We soon learn that Gandalf apparently ruined the reputation of the Bagginses, as they were very much conventional hobbits until Gandalf's intervention, as he describes giving Bilbo a little nudge out of the door, which is somewhat underselling what actually happened. Gandalf has now become known as a disturber of the peace, because from the perspective of the hobbits, he is this mysterious and powerful wizard who shows up from time to time and hangs out with Bilbo, the crazy old recluse, occasionally shoots fireworks at children, and then leaves. He is also an outsider, and hobbits don't like outsiders, and although they are certainly not hostile to him, there is absolutely a sense that they would prefer it if he didn't keep coming back and causing mischief. This also suggests that the town council or whatever had discussions about Gandalf, and they collectively decided that they don't like him. We get a comedic beat where Gandalf appears mildly concerned and perhaps a little disappointed that the hobbits of the Shire secretly dislike him, but then the very next thing he does is blast a load of fireworks out of his arse to entertain the children. He evidently doesn't particularly care if he is a disturber of the peace, and he doesn't care if he is pissing off some of the hobbits. Gandalf is not being reckless or dangerous because he is infinitely more powerful than the hobbits, and he knows exactly what he is doing. No one is going to get hurt, and he likes making the children happy. So he decides to embrace his newfound title, Gandalf the Disturber of the Peace. It is also notable that the hobbits seem quite torn on Gandalf. Him setting off the fireworks in the middle of the day seems to get a mixed reception, but the hobbits at the party certainly do appear to enjoy them, even though they nearly get hit by one, so it may be as simple as the hobbits thinking it inappropriate to do such things so early in the day, as this interrupts the peaceful life they enjoy. This is one of many examples of Gandalf having a bit of a sarcastic, deadpan sense of humour. Other examples are when he one-ups Bilbo with his magic smoke ship, and when he rhetorically asks,
I suppose you think that was terribly clever.
Translation, that was not clever. I know exactly how you did that, and you are a fucking idiot. The first thing we hear from Gandalf is him singing The Road Goes Ever On and On, which gives him a connection to Bilbo before he meets Frodo. In the book, we learn that this song was written by Bilbo, and Bilbo sings it himself later when he leaves Bag End. Even without the book knowledge that this song was written by Bilbo, the fact that both Gandalf and Bilbo sing the same song speaks to their friendship and their adventure 60 years earlier. We never hear this song anywhere else, and so it serves as a means of bonding the two characters by giving them something that no one else has. The simple fact that Gandalf, a powerful wizard, will take the time to come to Bilbo's birthday party in the Shire, where outsiders are generally not welcome, also speaks to the closeness of their friendship. Their history is again implied when Gandalf knocks on the door, and instead of being put off by Bilbo's autistic screeching from inside the house, Gandalf finds this highly amusing. He's like, oh, this motherfucker hasn't changed a bit. He's just as easy to annoy as I recall. Gandalf is shown throughout the film to have a close relationship with hobbits, whilst very few of the other characters would have much, if any, idea as to what a hobbit even is. Aragorn will have been familiar with them as a result of his time spent as a ranger. Legolas may have heard of them, but would almost certainly never have spent any time amongst them, and I would assume that the same applies to Gimli. Boromir would probably be like, I don't know what that is, because Gondor is on the other side of the continent, and he would have no reason to have encountered hobbits before. Aside from Legolas, Gandalf is the only member of the Fellowship who has lived for thousands of years, and both characters are substantially older than the third oldest, who is Gimli at around 140 years old. We know from this film that Gandalf has been visiting the Shire relatively frequently in recent years, and that he was directly involved in Bilbo's adventure 60 years earlier. However, if we reference The Hobbit, we learn that Gandalf had been visiting the Shire for many years, even before the events of The Hobbit, and so he has plenty of experience in dealing with hobbits and understanding how they operate. The result of this, going forward, is that Gandalf initially has a much closer relationship with the four hobbits than anyone else. and this was something the filmmakers understood, and so took rather amusing steps towards ensuring that the actors were comfortable working together.
Ian shared our trailer. So if you can imagine, the 4 hobbits in a trailer with Ian McKellen.
I was sort of partitioned off. I don't know why. Perhaps it was thought that Gandalf wouldn't want to talk to lesser beings.
There was an entrance at this end of the bus and an entrance at that end of the bus. And when Ian was in the chair, we always used the other entrance out of respect.
But I was rather grateful of having a rather, albeit flimsy, partition, because Elijah Wood in particular, and Dominic Monaghan liked to play music quite loudly early in the morning, and it wasn't always music that was to my taste.
So that became kind of difficult. You know, you'd kind of hear him sort of in the back of the trailer.
Gandalf's sense of timing is interesting, as although he suggests that wizards are never late, this is simply not true, unless we go with Gandalf's own definition of late. He was supposedly late arriving in Hobbiton, which is to say that he arrived at a time after the one he was expected at, but he quickly informs Frodo that wizards are never late because they only ever arrive when they mean to, which tells us that Gandalf pretty much just does his own thing. He will arrive and leave again when it suits him, and this implies that whatever he is doing when he is not on screen is potentially quite important. He doesn't run on anyone else's schedule other than his own. Additionally, this sets up Gandalf's line to Frodo in Rivendell,
I was delayed.
where, although he notably does not use the word late, he was nonetheless late. And this emphasizes that something pretty terrible must have happened for Gandalf to miss his appointment. This also pays off during the Battle of Helm's Deep, when Gandalf again arrives precisely when he means to, which very deliberately coincides with the sun rising. Gandalf has a constant air of mystery surrounding him, and this is largely communicated via what he chooses to say or not say. However, this is also communicated simply by how and where he is portrayed on screen. There are 2 separate occasions where both the audience and Bilbo are unsure as to where Gandalf is, only for him to suddenly appear and catch us by surprise. The writers ensure that this does not come off as sinister, because Gandalf is about the furthest you can get from a sinister character. He seems to disappear in Bag End and then shows up behind Bilbo asking for a cup of tea, and this is treated as though Bilbo got carried away talking to himself, and by the time he had finished, Gandalf had moved. The second time this happens is after Bilbo uses the ring, only this time Gandalf seems to teleport. But rather than being a teleportation in the sense that the character could not have done this naturally, it is instead portrayed as though Gandalf moved quickly and was unnoticed, perhaps through magical means, not that he literally zapped himself into Bag End to confront Bilbo. This is good because if this was only possible through honest-to-God teleportation, then this would raise questions later in the film when he does not teleport, given that he must have teleported in Bag End. Gandalf's relationship with Merry and Pippin is both endearing, amusing, and exceptionally well communicated in basically no time and with only a single line of dialogue. We know that Gandalf is known for his fireworks, and we can see that his collection of fireworks is abnormal. They are larger, and they appear to have been magically enhanced. He also chuckles to himself when he selects which fireworks to use, because he enjoys entertaining the hobbits by showing them things that they would never normally see. Gandalf is essentially like a more controlled and responsible version of Merry and Pippin. He is deliberately selecting fireworks for maximum impact, and the difference between Gandalf doing this as compared to Merry and Pippin is that they have no idea what they are doing, and so they or someone else may get hurt as a result. The giant dragon firework was presumably brought along because Gandalf intended to use it himself, which could be interpreted as him carelessly giving Bilbo PTSD by scaring the shit out of him, given that Bilbo was himself nearly killed by Smaug, and so it could seem entirely inappropriate for Gandalf to bring a giant red dragon firework to this elderly gentleman's birthday party. But the alternative explanation for this is that Gandalf knows that what happened with Smaug was the pinnacle of Bilbo's adventure. He was the brave hobbit who encountered a dragon and lived to tell the tale. And reminding everyone of Bilbo's accomplishments before Bilbo pieced out never to be seen again was certainly intentional on Gandalf's part. This was all planned and designed for a specific purpose. However, Merry and Pippin decided to launch the firework early, entirely because it was the biggest one they could find. Because it is a magical firework, we can assume that the reason it nearly collided with the party guests is because the people who launched it could not control it. And it is entirely possible that the only reason why the dragon did not crash into the ground or otherwise harm the partygoers was because Gandalf realized what had happened, and so he used magic to prevent any serious harm. His single line to Merry and Pippin in this scene,
"I might have known,"
tells us that he knows exactly who they are, and that he should have expected that they would do something like this. They clearly have a reputation, and Gandalf was perhaps a little careless for not seeing this coming. Gandalf is used multiple times during this chunk of the film to drive home the threat of the One Ring. And part of why this works so well is because this is the rare instance of the audience having more information than Gandalf. We already know that Bilbo has the One Ring, whilst Gandalf initially only knows that Bilbo is being a bit weird, and he later realizes that Bilbo has a magic ring, but has no reason to believe that it is anything more than that. After Bilbo uses the ring, we get 4 very deliberate reaction shots from the crowd. The first 2 show us the hobbits in shock and disbelief as to what they just saw. The third shows Frodo, who is less shocked by the magical disappearance and more confused as to why Bilbo did this, whilst Gandalf's reaction is saved until last, because his reaction is the most important and it communicates the most information. Unlike Frodo, Gandalf understands what it is to become invisible like that, and although he has no reason to believe that this is the One Ring, he has just realized that Bilbo has a magical ring, and he is using it for shits and gigs, which is obviously dangerous. Before you finish typing that comment, yes, I know that what I am saying about Gandalf's knowledge is technically incorrect, so I'll make a brief note on adaptation. In both the books and the entire 6-film Middle-earth saga, Gandalf is explicitly aware that Bilbo had a magical ring. My preferred take on this is that we ignore the Hobbit trilogy and we treat this scene as it was treated when The Fellowship of the Ring was the only film in the series. Gandalf suspects that something is slightly off with Bilbo, and when he turns invisible, Gandalf is like, oh okay, I need to take this seriously because that little fucker is messing with stuff he doesn't understand. The Fellowship of the Ring treats Bilbo turning invisible as Gandalf's first acknowledgement that Bilbo has a magic ring, and this is why he reacts in the way that he does. This goes down slightly differently in the books, so I don't consider it a problem in the books, but because of how this scene plays out in the film, I do not at all like the revelation in the Battle of the Five Armies that Gandalf knew the whole time that Bilbo had a magic ring that could turn him invisible, even though this is broadly accurate to the books. If Gandalf had come into contact with the ring or even asked to see it, which would be the responsible thing to do and would have been in character given his extensive investigation into Sauron's potential return during those movies, he would have likely realized its true nature 60 years earlier than he did, and if Gandalf already knew that Bilbo had a magic invisibility ring, then this makes his reaction in The Fellowship of the Ring nonsensical. Anyway, Gandalf fundamentally disapproves of Bilbo misusing magical objects, and this was precisely his reaction to Merry and Pippin fucking around with his fireworks. Gandalf can use magic rings, and Gandalf can use magic fireworks, because Gandalf knows what he is doing. Bilbo, Merry, and Pippin do not, and so they should not. Even if the ring Bilbo has is just some lesser magic ring that only turns you invisible and doesn't want to take over the world, he still objects to Bilbo doing this because Bilbo cannot possibly understand what he is doing. He later scares the shit out of Bilbo when Bilbo tries to leave with the ring, because by that point Gandalf had realized that he could not allow Bilbo to leave with it. Gandalf attempted to talk him out of it, and he only chose intimidation when diplomacy failed. Had intimidation also failed, which it nearly did, Gandalf may have had no choice but to use more violent means by which to forcibly take the ring, or more likely to prevent Bilbo from leaving, because although Bilbo taking the ring with him would be a pretty bad outcome, Gandalf forcibly taking the ring from Bilbo would be even worse. Upon returning, Gandalf does not test the ring himself. He heats it in the fire and then gives it to Frodo to check if anything happens. Ultimately, when the lettering is revealed, Gandalf is unsurprised. He pretty much already knew that this was the One Ring, he just had to be sure. As Gandalf explains the nature of Sauron and the ring, he is shown to be terrified. He has no choice but to verbalize his worst fears because he needs Frodo to understand why Sauron cannot ever find the ring. Upon realizing the danger he is in, Frodo understandably urges Gandalf to take it, which terrifies Gandalf even more. He is already actively trying not to take the ring, even though he would wish to use it for good, and Frodo insisting that he take the ring for an entirely pragmatic and sensible reason makes it that much harder to resist. Gandalf understands that the consequences of him taking the ring would be that much worse than pretty much anyone else in Middle-earth. We also learn that Gandalf is selective with information. He doesn't tell Frodo anything about Bilbo's intentions when questioned, likely because he believes it is Bilbo's own responsibility to do this. He later smiles at Frodo when Frodo holds the ring, in spite of the fact that there is a reasonable chance that this is the One Ring. He doesn't want to scare Frodo or tip him off about anything. He literally just needs Frodo to put the ring in a box and forget about it until he comes back. He can't risk Frodo either using or losing the ring. When he returns, he again does not explain anything until he has to, and Gandalf is single-minded in his need to confirm the nature of this ring before he does anything else, because he needs to know that this was all one massive overreaction. Additionally, Gandalf claims that Bilbo has gone to stay with the elves, which is not entirely true. If Bilbo was intending to retread his entire journey, or at the very least if he wanted to travel far enough east to see mountains again, then Gandalf chose not to tell Frodo about this. And of course, Gandalf ended up being correct, because Bilbo's age caught up with him by the time he arrived in Rivendell, as a result of being separated from the ring. Gandalf almost certainly was not guessing that this would happen to Bilbo, as he had not yet confirmed that this was the One Ring, so he was likely simply trying to put Frodo's mind at ease by saying, "Don't worry, he's with the elves," rather than saying anything about him going mountaineering at the ripe old age of 111. However, once the stakes get dialed up to 11, Gandalf is completely honest with Frodo and he doesn't hide anything. He openly says that he has no idea what to do. All he can do for now is get the ring away from where the Nazgul are looking for it. So he sends Frodo to Bree while he travels to see Saruman to ask for advice. This shows that Gandalf, the powerful and knowledgeable wizard, is caught off guard and needs help, which excellently hypes up the danger and power of the ring. He is shown to be impressed by Frodo's courage and quick acceptance of his dangerous task, which inspires Gandalf and gives him hope that they will find a solution to their predicament, even though the situation is pretty dire. I also want to briefly touch on Gandalf's magical powers as they are depicted in this section of the film. Broadly speaking, the use of magic in these films is understated, and we generally do not have wizards levitating and squirting fireballs at each other.
You know, I didn't want to have too much magic in the movie because I don't like magic in films, in fantasy films.
The aversion to the overt use of magic, which I think is a sensible decision, meant the writers needed to imply what Gandalf can do without showing or mentioning it. He somehow launches a load of fireworks from his cart, presumably by magic rather than with a timer that had been set to go off at that precise moment, which suggests that he lit the fireworks by conjuring a tiny amount of fire on the firework fuses. During the party, he appears to light the fireworks using his staff, and although he does not appear to do this when he is on his cart, if you look closely, you can see that his staff is in the back of the cart with the fireworks, which might explain how he did this. The fireworks themselves are certainly magical in nature, as they do things that actual fireworks simply can't do. It is suggested that Gandalf made the fireworks himself, and so he was presumably able to imbue them with these magical properties. He turns his smoke ring into a ship, which is either a visual trick or Gandalf has precise control over air particles. And finally, he draws the light out of the room when intimidating Bilbo and distorting his voice. All of this can be summed up as very basic manipulation of light, fire, and air. There is nothing complicated or confusing about what Gandalf can do, which means it is easy to understand what is acceptable and what is not. If, later in the film, Gandalf were to snuff out a candle using his mind, we would be like, okay, that makes sense, and we would not question it. If, however, Gandalf were to teleport and then detonate himself in a gigantic explosion of light that took out scores of enemies, this would feel like bullshit, and it does feel like bullshit when he does precisely this in The Hobbit. Anyway, Gandalf is repeatedly depicted as having a vast knowledge of Middle-earth and of magic. And although his own abilities appear to be very simple, there is always the threat and implication that he could do more. As he directly says to Bilbo, "Do not take me for some conjurer of cheap tricks." He uses this threat of unknown levels of power to coerce Bilbo, Merry, Pippin, and Sam into doing what he wants. But in all cases, this was as a response to their misbehavior. Bilbo was letting himself be driven mad by the ring, Merry and Pippin were launching magical fireworks in an irresponsible manner, and Sam was eavesdropping and overheard things that he should not have. Gandalf is not running around spooking people into obeying him, but he is certainly capable of doing so if he wished. He, in some sense, counteracts the magical allure of the ring by bringing Bilbo to his senses, but this is not just him casting a spell that undoes the spooky magic ring. This is Gandalf making an appeal to Bilbo's rationality by reminding him of their friendship, and he uses magic to assist in this by forcing Bilbo to pay attention to him. This is a far more interesting use of magic, as it is not used as an easy way out for the writers. Gandalf doesn't just cast a spell and make Bilbo snap out of it. Instead, he uses words that are amplified in tone and volume by magic to convince Bilbo to leave the ring behind. But as described earlier, even this doesn't fully work, as Bilbo tries to leave with the ring anyway. All of this has the effect of suggesting that Gandalf is probably very powerful, but he is clearly not as powerful as the influence of the ring. Gandalf does not have any kind of musical theme, and the reason for this is that Howard Shore considers Gandalf to be the guy who makes everything happen. He moves between all of the other characters, and no one character or location can be tied to Gandalf specifically. Overall, Gandalf is legendary, and in any other movie he would be my favourite character. But unfortunately, he is competing with Boromir, and that is a fight he cannot win. His character introduction is handled perfectly. We very quickly get a sense for how he operates, and the writers use him effectively to build tension and expand the setting, whilst convincing us of the close relationship he has with both Bilbo and Frodo, and ultimately, it is Gandalf who sets the story of The Lord of the Rings in motion. The other Hobbit characters are all introduced during this sequence, but we only get limited information for them. The first is Samwise Gamgee, played excellently by Sean Astin. There are many things that we can complain about in the current timeline, but no matter how bad things get, we are at the very least in the timeline where James Corden did not get the part of Samwise Gamgee, despite having auditioned for it. Yes, that was almost a possibility.
He's always stuffing his face when Master's not looking.
That's a filthy lie! Tommy! Stop it! I'll get it!
Whenever these sorts of moments come my way, I like to adopt, quite a British attitude of sort of, keep calm and carry on. Things are going to get written about me. Never complain, never explain. It's very much my motto.
The extended edition shows us a brief shot of Sam gardening during the Concerning Hobbits sequence, which is, amusingly, the only shot of him doing any gardening in the entire trilogy. But we are not actually introduced to the character until the party. He is introduced via his unrealized romance with Rosie Cotton. She appears to like him, but he is too shy to make a move. Frodo then forces Sam to dance with her, and he laughs from the sidelines. This is extremely simple, but it is super quick and effective, and it is paid off perfectly at the end of The Return of the King. This is also Frodo forcing Sam out of his comfort zone, which is exactly what Gandalf is about to do to Frodo. It is unclear from just the party scene exactly how well Sam and Frodo know each other, as we get no indication as to what their relationship is, only that Frodo knows him well enough to know what Sam is thinking and what he wants to do, how Sam will respond, and that it is socially acceptable for him to essentially force Sam to do something that he doesn't have the balls to do on his own. Sam seems to be more grown up than the other three hobbits, which is first communicated when we see him in The Green Dragon. Instead of having fun singing and dancing with Frodo, Merry and Pippin, he is sitting at a table listening to a discussion between three much older hobbits. The gaffer's full name is never stated, and Sam's relationship with him is never even implied until the Two Towers.
Oh, Gaffer'd have a thing or two to say if he could see us now.
But this character, the gaffer, is Hamfast Gamgee, Sam's father, which means Sam has chosen to sit with his dad and listen to him ramble about stuff going on elsewhere instead of drinking with his friends. Although Sam is clearly less interested in what his dad and his friends have to say, and he is more interested in keeping an eye on Rosie.
Two eyes.
Sam's relationship, or lack of relationship, with Rosie is somewhat idealistic and relies entirely on her being interested in him, despite him being a bit of a nothing burger from her perspective. He smiles at her in the pub, but again becomes shy and looks away. He is shown to be jealous, and he doesn't like other people trying it on with Rosie. He is nervous of looking like an idiot in front of her, which perhaps explains why he didn't want to dance, and why he was not partying in the pub. He did not want to put himself on display because he was afraid that she would lose any potential interest she has in him. He could, of course, just talk to her, but Sam is terrified of rejection, even though Rosie is clearly begging Sam to trim her verge. This is, again, extremely simple characterization, but it works as a solid foundation from which to build the character. Sam later drops some eaves on Gandalf and Frodo. He claims that he heard raised voices, so he went to have a look. Presumably, he recognized the voices as Gandalf and Frodo, so he knew that no one was in immediate danger, and he then became caught up in listening to their conversation, which is why he did not make his presence known. In a word, this happens as a result of Sam's curiosity, a trait that is common among the hobbits to varying degrees. A minor note is that if Sam is telling the truth about hearing raised voices, which I assume he is because, as Gandalf points out, it is a little late to be trimming the verge, then this means he overheard Frodo and Gandalf speaking loudly. The only part of their conversation in which they are speaking loudly is, "But that would lead them here. Take it, Gandalf. You must take it. I'm giving it to you." I just realized how dirty that sounds in isolation. Oh no. And this exchange happens after all of the conversations about Sauron and the ring, which means it appears that Sam could not have overheard anything about a ring, a Dark Lord, or the end of the world. In order for this to make sense, then, we must assume that the raised voices that Sam heard were during Gandalf's initial exposition dump to Frodo that we did not see. Which makes a bit more sense because this happens pretty soon after Sam walks past Bag End, and so he could more plausibly have overheard them, which, if true, means Sam overheard pretty much the entire conversation. Sam is shown to be physically slower than Frodo, and he is obviously less experienced at hiking, and he has less of a sense of urgency. This is because he is both overweight and he has never left the border of the Shire. In summary, Samwise Gamgee lacks balls. He is comfortable simply existing. He enjoys the easy life. Don't speak to the girl. Don't risk embarrassing yourself. Don't leave your home. He is motivated entirely by fear. Everything he does or does not do is because he is afraid. He will not speak to Rosie because he is scared of looking like an idiot. He pauses in the field because he is afraid of traveling into the unknown. He joins Frodo on his quest because he is afraid of Gandalf. We all know where Sam's story ends up going, and a huge part of why that works so well is because of how fantastically all of this was set up during the Shire sequences.
Samwise the Brave.
Bilbo's a unique guy. I'm so just blessed to have met him, you know.
Dom's an idiot.
Merry and Pippin are characterized as troublemakers, but Merry is shown to be the ringleader. He is clearly smarter, and he gets Pippin to do the dirty work, which means Merry has plausible deniability. Merry throws Pippin into Gandalf's cart, which means Merry could run away if things went south, whilst Pippin could not. Pippin selects the firework for Merry's approval, and we are explicitly told that the firework heist was Merry's idea.
Everything needs to do more than one thing. We were trying to bring Merry and Pippin to life more, talking about ideas to do that, and I just said, well, Merry and Pippin should steal a firework and light it. Even though I knew it wasn't in the book, I just felt that you need the energy at that point because this is a party. You want to see some lightness and fun at the front of this movie because it gets very dark and you're looking for something unexpected. You're introducing two main characters, you're saying something about them. You're also referencing an event that actually does take place in the book, which is that Gandalf has a firework which becomes Smaug the dragon. So, you want everything that you do to hopefully do 3 or 4 things in terms of turning that piece of prose into a filmic moment.
Merry's response to the firework after Pippin has lit the fuse is interesting, because there are a couple of ways we can interpret this. Either Merry was equally as dumb as Pippin. He told Pippin to light the firework and only then realized that it was not stuck in the ground, and subsequently he tried to blame Pippin for not doing it properly. Or alternatively, everything Merry did here was calculated. He deliberately told Pippin to light the firework, knowing that it hadn't been set up properly, and he did this because he wanted to scare the shit out of Pippin. I would lean on the former rather than the latter, because I don't know if I like the idea of Merry deliberately setting off a giant magic dragon firework improperly, because doing so could have resulted in it going off inside the tent and burning or killing them. So I interpret this scene as Merry and Pippin both being at fault, likely due to a combination of being overly eager to try out the firework, as well as being drunk at a party. Either way, this tells us that Merry is reckless, he does not plan ahead, and he is irresponsible.
As soon as it goes bang, you've just got to let it go, okay? So
Peter said to us that when we're holding the firework, it will be lifted up by a piece of string and there'll be like a...
Well, I didn't know. Whoosh! It was your idea.
To just kind of scare us and let the cameraman know when the cut is going to happen for the real explosion. But Billy, being this kind of slightly feminine character that he is, was really quite scared by it and made this girly kind of woo shriek, which I barely got through the take on.
Supposed to stick it in the ground. Where's in the ground? Outside. That is your idea.
I just get such a fright, and Dom just gave me abuse for it all day.
This was your idea.
Nobody told us that it was actually going to blow up, I thought we were just going to do that and then we'd do the blowing up bit later. So it did blow up. I shrieked, wet myself.
Pippin, conversely, is shown to be younger and less intelligent than Merry, and he is, frankly, a bit of a doofus. He does things without thinking, and he is a pussy. When he and Merry conspire to steal the firework, Pippin first chooses a tiny one, before Merry is like, no, let's get a big one, fool of a took. This whole sequence shows that Pippin is easily manipulable, and he is pushed into causing trouble by Merry, but he certainly enjoys this as he intends to continue causing mayhem, even though the firework could have seriously injured them.
Let's get another one.
Pippin is different to Merry in that he doesn't appear to know any better. He has a level of ignorance that Merry does not, and he appears to genuinely be an idiot. Merry is irresponsible because Merry should and does know better, but he causes trouble anyway because he enjoys fucking around, whilst Pippin is simply unwise and naive. This next section is going to discuss Howard Shore's music that he composed for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and as I said in the prologue video, if you don't know music theory, that's absolutely fine. The point of this is that I would like to explain why and how some of the musical ideas were used in a manner that can be understood by people who don't have any interest in music theory. But with that out of the way, let's get started. The Fellowship theme is gradually introduced throughout the Fellowship of the Ring as we meet the various characters. Aside from the 3 chords that we heard very briefly during the prologue, the first time we hear it in anything approaching a complete form is when we get the title card for the Fellowship of the Ring, which then associates this melody with the Fellowship itself. There is no development of the theme in this part of the film, and so this serves as a baseline from which Howard Shore adds the additional components we get later. This is both the first and last piece of music we hear during the Shire sequence, as it plays during the title card, and again just after Frodo and Sam cross the threshold, and Frodo quotes Bilbo.
It's a dangerous business, Frodo.
The Fellowship is at this point in its earliest stages. It consists of 2 hobbits, and they have now left their home. The first piece of music Howard Shore composed for The Lord of the Rings was his theme for the Shire and the Hobbits. His early mock-up sounds very similar to what ended up being the finished track, with some minor rhythmic differences and instrumentation changes.
I think it was based more on the beauty of New Zealand, because Hobbiton is so inherently, I just had a feeling of New Zealand, of that rural beauty to it. And I wrote the Shire theme pretty early on, and then related the Shire theme to Frodo. The Shire theme is probably the most innocent theme in the film. I wanted it to have a rural feeling. I wanted to have enough malleability to be able to create a heroic feeling to it. And as Frodo takes the ring and he's on his journey, that this theme would carry with him through the story. And in the beginning, in the Shire, you hear a much more sort of frolicking version of it.
The purpose of this theme is to give a sense of innocence, homeliness, and a safe way of life, because this is what is under threat. It is designed to function as the essence of what it is to be a hobbit. In a sense, it is their heartbeat, and this is one reason why, although some of the other Shire themes remain localized to the Shire, this theme follows Frodo on his quest. Appropriately, there are multiple variations throughout the trilogy. For example, it is played on a whistle when Frodo is first introduced, giving it a peaceful and personal vibe.
Boy.
When Gandalf arrives at Bag End and meets Bilbo, the theme is played on strings, which gives it a more formal and nostalgic vibe.
Who would believe it?
When Gandalf and Bilbo are smoking their pipes, the theme reverts back to the whistle, because they are relaxing and they have nothing to worry about other than enjoying the simple life, and the theme again switches back to strings when Gandalf and Bilbo say goodbye, which is a more serious scene, and this also mirrors their introduction. Rather interestingly, the Shire theme uses the same 3 pitches as the Seduction of the Ring theme that we haven't heard yet, but where the Shire theme is in a major key, the Seduction of the Ring theme is in a minor key. They, in some sense, mirror each other, as the film wants the audience to be seduced by the whimsical beauty of the Shire, just as the characters are seduced by the ring. All of the Shire themes are simple, calming, upbeat, and friendly, which contrasts them with the music from the prologue. As the hobbits do not like the outside world, Howard Shore appropriately does not invade the Shire with any themes or instrumentation from elsewhere, until, of course, the evil of the ring begins to seep into their lives. This theme plays many times throughout this chunk of the film, perhaps most effectively when Frodo gears up and prepares to leave, and Gandalf is given hope that the smallest people can make the biggest difference. By that point in the film, the music has been through a bit of a roller coaster, as I'm about to get to, and the simple return to the Shire theme closely associates it with Frodo's bravery. It plays a final time during this part of the film as Frodo and Sam cross the field, before transitioning into the Fellowship theme, which brings the Shire section full circle. One stage of their journey is over, another begins. Hobbits truly are amazing creatures. The rural theme for the Shire has a clear Celtic influence. It features Irish and Scottish instruments, most notably the fiddle, and it was intended to sound as though the hobbits could be playing the music themselves. It needed to sound natural, almost diegetic, and to evoke pure happiness and innocence. Unlike the previous theme, the rural theme does not ever appear outside of the Shire, and once we leave the Shire in the Fellowship of the Ring, we do not hear it again until the end of the Return of the King. It is used strictly to identify the Shire. The Hobbit outline is generally used to introduce hobbits and to build a sense of expectation. We first hear it when Frodo and Gandalf are trying not to laugh at each other, and it plays again when Frodo says, "All right then, keep your secrets." This simple 4-note outline is whimsical and is often used to accompany more comedic or endearing moments before leading into the other themes. The Hobbit skip beat appears in multiple forms, and it is similar in structure to certain other musical themes, notably the Mordor skip beat. The point of this is to show that Middle-earth is interconnected, and we hear this repeatedly when Bilbo panics, believing that he has lost the ring, where the skip beat plays in between increasingly intense strings. This music feels very different to the rest of the Shire music, but it is coherent. The Shire's musical themes are all composed around open fourths and fifths, even when things take a sinister turn, which then ensures that the music retains its hobbity elements. Panic starts to overwhelm Bilbo as the Hobbit soundscape is nearly drowned out by the intense string section, and when Bilbo finds the ring, the Hobbit accompaniment continues, and the strings move into a less intense but still dark and ominous chord progression. The skip beat continues throughout, which connects the two moods. The hymn setting is used primarily to show a loss of innocence. It is similar to the pensive theme, but it has a mournful, almost religious vibe to it. This is notably used when Bilbo tells Gandalf that he wants to see mountains again, as well as when Bilbo says goodbye to Frodo at the party. This is almost treated as a send-off for Bilbo, as if he is gone before he has even left. This theme appears in an incomplete manner when Frodo tells Gandalf that Bilbo has been acting strangely. It appears again when Bilbo says goodbye to Frodo, and it finally reappears with a complete melody when Frodo pulls Sam out of the river at the end of the film. This theme is intended to represent the way Frodo views the world, and, like the hymn setting, to convey a loss of innocence. This theme is a combination of the pensive, rural, and hymn settings, and it is used in specific moments that require a hobbity texture, but need an extra punch of gravitas and seriousness. Gollum does not appear in this part of the film, aside from his hands, but the musical connection to Gollum is clearly heard when Bilbo is tempted by the ring and refers to it as his precious, where the Pity of Gollum theme then plays in a lower register. Gollum's theme is typically played on a cor anglais, but here it is played on a clarinet, as clarinets are part of the Hobbit soundscape, and so this helps to connect Bilbo to Gollum without simply playing Gollum's theme with no alterations. This theme does not play in full, as it is interrupted by Gandalf, his intention in the scene being to snap Bilbo out of it and prevent him from ending up like Gollum. It is interesting that the music references Gollum, whilst Gandalf's dialogue can only be referencing Isildur after Bilbo refers to the ring as my precious. But this musical direction was presumably chosen because, although the connection to Isildur is mechanically relevant, as this is what allows Gandalf to discover the true nature of the ring, the thematic connection has nothing to do with Isildur. The music is accomplishing the same goal as the visuals. It is suggesting that Bilbo is going to be corrupted by the ring and will end up like Gollum. We hear part of Gollum's theme again as Gandalf leaves Bag End and tells Frodo that there are things that he must see to, and that he has questions that need answers. This never evolves into Gollum's full theme, and the repeating 5-note pattern is instead the section from Gollum's theme that forms the weakness and redemption motif that is used in multiple parts of the score. This could be referencing a few things. The subtle musical reference to Gollum may have been Howard Shore's way of suggesting that one of the reasons why Gandalf is leaving is because he needs to find Gollum. And the weakness and redemption motif could be referencing the fact that the ring is calling to Gandalf and begging him to take it, even though he does not yet know for certain what it is. The Pity of Gollum theme plays again when Frodo and Gandalf discuss Bilbo finding the ring in Gollum's cave, and it plays a final time when Gandalf laments that he was unable to locate Gollum before the enemy did. Here, the theme appears in its full form, played on a cor anglais as it typically is when the theme is directly associated with Gollum rather than the downstream effects of Gollum. It is also important that the Pity theme plays while Gollum is being tortured, which ties Gollum's musical themes in with the emotions of sadness and pain. The theme then repeats as Frodo realizes that Gollum told the enemy where to find the ring, only this time the theme is accompanied by horns, which builds intensity and forms a musical connection with the various Mordor themes as Mordor is closing in on Frodo. The descending third plays during a dramatic beat when Bilbo holds out the ring and eventually decides to drop it to the floor and leave it behind. This is the first musical reference to Sauron's power being present in the Shire, and this is both an appropriate choice in terms of which Mordor theme to use, as this one represents impending doom, but it also draws a musical connection between what is happening right now in the Shire and what we saw 3,000 years ago in the Prologue. This can be interpreted in a couple of ways. One is that the power of the ring is tempting Bilbo to keep it for himself, hence the relevance of the impending doom motif, but the other is that by leaving the ring behind, which is what ends up happening, Frodo embarks on a quest to destroy it, which means either way, the characters are going to be in extreme peril. The descending third plays a second time when the lettering on the ring is revealed and Gandalf's worst fears are confirmed. The History of the Ring theme plays when Frodo picks up the ring, and this is somewhat unassuming because it happens in the background. At this point in the film, we have heard this theme 4 times prior to this scene, and so it is easily the most recognizable theme so far. This highlights that Frodo's life is about to change dramatically, but the dialogue has him address Bilbo's disappearance rather than the ring, because the ring is currently of no particular importance to him. The music, however, highlights to the audience that the ring is of the utmost importance. Frodo just doesn't know it yet. As in the prologue, this theme is used whenever the ring changes hands, and because Gandalf did not touch it, the ring never passed to him, and it went straight from Bilbo to Frodo. Later, when Gandalf explains to Frodo that Sauron is seeking to recover the ring so that he can cover Middle-earth in darkness, the History of the Ring theme repeats once more, as the topic of conversation is that of the ring changing hands again and passing from Frodo to Sauron. As the film transitions from the shot of the envelope to Barad-dûr, we hear the Evil of the Ring theme in full for the first time. The evil of the ring, the evil of Mordor, and the evil of Sauron are all the same thing, and they all come from the same place, which is why the same musical theme is used to represent all three. Everything the ring does is an extension and consequence of Sauron. Unlike Sauron and Mordor, however, the ring has multiple themes because it has multiple moods. Sometimes it is seducing, sometimes it is foreboding, and sometimes it is pure unadulterated fucking evil. Importantly, we do not hear this theme in the prologue, although it is directly connected to the Mordor themes that we heard earlier, as the descending third motif is played underneath the Evil of the Ring theme. Only this time, the theme is a full-on musical barrage of intensity instead of a faint outline suggesting an idea. It is packed with augmented intervals, increasing tension and intensity. It has a heavy brass focus conveying unstoppable power, and it features chanting choirs giving it an almost religious vibe. The Evil of the Ring theme is violent and aggressive, unhinged and barely contained, and it serves as a baseline theme that is developed much later in the trilogy as Sauron comes closer and closer to what he sees as inevitable victory. The Evil of the Ring theme is violent and aggressive, unhinged and barely contained, and it serves as a baseline theme that is developed much later in the trilogy as Sauron comes closer and closer to what he sees as inevitable victory. The Evil of the Ring theme is violent and aggressive, unhinged and barely contained, and it serves as a baseline theme that is developed much later in the trilogy as Sauron comes closer and closer to what he sees as inevitable victory. We briefly hear the Mordor skip beat for the first time here as Gollum is tortured, which transitions us out of the Evil of the Ring theme and into the Ringwraith theme that comes next. The Mordor skip beat is used for much the same purpose as the Hobbit skip beat. It maintains or builds momentum in between or underneath other musical themes, and it serves as a means of connecting them together. This musical accompaniment continues as Gandalf hurries through Minas Tirith into the library, building a sense of urgency as, unbeknownst to him, Sauron has already dispatched his minions to recover the ring. This is the second time we have heard the Ringwraith's theme, although this is the first time we actually see them. I have a lot to say about this theme, but I am going to save that for the next video, when they really start to impact the story. But for now, this rendition is notably in 3/4 time instead of 4/4, which decreases the time in between each choir chant, and so it gives the impression of an immeasurable threat moving swiftly towards the Shire, instead of a controlled, deliberate, and unstoppable evil seeking to terrify its victims. This musical theme only appears a couple of times. It was first heard during the prologue when Galadriel's voiceover spoke of whispers of a nameless fear and a shadow in the east. This theme plays again when Frodo urges Gandalf to take the ring, and it is clearly being used to signify Gandalf's fear of what would happen if he accepted. He may become the nameless fear. I have mentioned the weakness and redemption theme a few times because it appears repeatedly throughout the score, but here it forms more of a focus than it does elsewhere. This most likely refers to Frodo's acceptance of his task after he attempted to give the ring to Gandalf. He shows incredible strength during this scene, as does Gandalf, as Gandalf repeatedly refuses the many opportunities he has to take the ring for himself. Immediately after Bilbo drops the ring, we get a repeat of the weakness and redemption motif that we have heard previously, signifying Bilbo overcoming his weakness by leaving the ring behind. Rather amusingly, the first time we hear the Threat of Mordor theme, it is actually relating to Sam, because Sam is the one spying on them. However, the point of this theme is that it represents the looming shadow of Sauron, and because the film has expertly dialed up the tension, we are fully expecting a Ringwraith to pop out and attack them. This theme was heard underscoring the Ringwraith theme during the prologue, which played when Sauron started beating the shit out of everyone, and so this theme repeating here draws a direct link to Sauron, violence, and the wielding of a terrible power. The seduction theme first plays when Gandalf warns Frodo never to use the ring. It is performed by a boys' choir, and it was intended to symbolize purity. Unlike the rest of the musical themes for the ring, this one does not change throughout almost the entire trilogy. This is because its seductive power is constant and unaffected by any other power in Middle-earth. Although in this instance the theme is not formed out of words, only vocalizations, because the ring has not yet begun to sink its teeth into Frodo. The first 3 notes of the Seduction of the Ring theme also form a part of the Fellowship of the Ring theme, which ties the two themes together and implies that the ring is always exerting its influence, even in the most heroic and uplifting parts of the score. The Journey There is a simple melody that plays over the weakness and redemption motif. This theme plays during the first of many travel montages in the trilogy. There are 3 separate shots of the hobbits walking, and the Journey There melody repeats 3 times, gradually moving higher in register as the hobbits travel further from their home. This theme is not used often, but it does show up again when Frodo, Sam, and Gollum are close to Mordor. The cinematography in these films is deceptively complex as a result of the numerous scale tricks being used in almost every scene. the vast use of miniatures and computer-generated effects, and the fact that all of this blends together seamlessly. This means that what appears to be a fairly routine and ordinary sequence featuring a conversation between two characters will often have been far more difficult and complex to convincingly pull off than it first appears. Before I get into the scale stuff, however, I just want to highlight one specific shot due to its length, its purpose, its framing, and its execution. Just before Bilbo leaves, we get an extended single-take sequence that lasts for about a minute, which isn't particularly long when compared to some, but I want to highlight this one because of how fucking good it is.
This was a difficult shot because it's so long. If you just look at it, it just keeps going and going and going without cutting. And this single shot took us an entire day to shoot because I really wanted to sell the idea again of Ian Holm and Ian McKellen being together and being different sizes. And I thought it was worth it because the shot's over a minute long, which means you're not spending the entire day doing a 8 or 9 second difficult shot, you're doing a minute long difficult shot, so it makes the time worthwhile.
This scene is a conversation between Gandalf and Bilbo, and in the script it is quite literally just that. Gandalf says his lines, and then Bilbo says his lines until the scene ends. If a lazy or less competent director were to take creative control over this scene, they would almost certainly opt for shooting it via shot-reverse shot, which is typically when you film everything at once with the camera pointing at one character, then you do it again pointing at the other character, and then you alternate between these shots in the editing room. There isn't anything wrong with shot-reverse shot, it is used all the time for a reason, and that reason is not just that it is relatively easy to do. It is a simple and clearly understandable framework from which you can film a conversation between two characters. However, particularly when you are dealing with visual tricks such as those used to depict the Hobbits, as soon as you throw in an edit by cutting to another camera, the audience will subconsciously know that this cut exists for a reason. And one reason may well be that the filmmakers are trying to hide something. This is similar to how a magician might say, "Hey you, pay close attention to this object in my right hand," which means they do not want you to look at their left hand because they are probably doing something important with it. The act of cutting between multiple angles is a means of directing the audience's attention specifically towards whatever it is that you want them to see. However, in a one-shot sequence, whilst you are still directing the audience's attention, there are far fewer obvious places you can hide, which is why, on a technical level, these sequences can end up being incredibly impressive. Scenes like this one in Bag End show how, with a bit of creativity, less conventional cinematography can do wonders for immersion, which is particularly important here because The Lord of the Rings takes place in a fantasy setting that is in many ways different to the world we are used to. If we were cutting to close-ups of Gandalf and Bilbo as they have their conversation, then this would still communicate the verbal content of the scene, but it would not do anything to help build the illusion that Bilbo is half the size of Gandalf. This scene was filmed in multiple passes at different scales and then blended together to give the effect we see in the finished film, which means Ian Holm and Ian McKellen were not actually in the room with each other when this was filmed.
We were not doing this together. This was filmed on separate occasions, so Ian was looking up into space and so I'm looking down into it, and the eyeline wasn't quite accurate there.
So this is all split set stuff. We had two interior bag end sets at two different scales. We had motion control camera work in them, so they would shoot one sequence and then they would dismantle and reassemble the camera in the different scale set and do the same sequence. Sometimes so the actors would be shot against blue screen and sometimes they'd be shot in the alternate sets.
The challenge is that it becomes very difficult to match eye lines because what the character is supposed to be looking at is not actually there. If you are substituting something on set for something else, then if the actor is looking in the wrong place, this will break the illusion. This is why, for example, Josh Brolin had a cardboard cutout of Thanos' head at the appropriate height above his own head, so that the other actors could look up at Thanos instead of accidentally looking at Josh Brolin, who is about the height of Thanos' nipples. The focus of the shot alternates between Gandalf and Bilbo. Gandalf's face is obscured for much of it, which means any eyeline mismatches are easier to hide, and Bilbo's primary focus is on packing his bags rather than looking at Gandalf, which somewhat simplifies the task of lining up both performances. However, they still need to look at each other at key moments, and Bilbo keeps moving around Gandalf, which means this was not a simple thing to do. The shot begins by following Bilbo, giving the impression that he is going to leave, and that we are going to follow him as he leaves. But almost immediately he is interrupted by Gandalf, who has surprised him by appearing inside his house. The point of this is to sell the illusion, but this doesn't feel like a showpiece where the filmmakers are drawing attention to themselves by going, hey, look at this awesome special effect we made. The whole point is that it is seamless, which is why this scene is filmed in a manner in which you might film a real scene between a 6-foot wizard and a 3-foot hobbit. One benefit of long unbroken camera shots is that they can help draw you into the setting by removing the unnatural part of filmmaking, that is, cutting from one angle to another. By following one camera for an extended period of time, the audience is able to experience a scene from one perspective, instead of from multiple perspectives that have been stitched together in the editing room. Lengthy one-shot sequences have become more common in recent years because, although they are extremely complex and difficult to orchestrate, they are a selling point because of how impressive they can be. This is even more the case in action sequences, and this likely happened, in part, as a pushback against the frenetic and overly edited quick-cut style of action filmmaking that became popular in the 2000s. There are ways of hiding cuts and faking an extended one-take sequence, and the more these tricks are used, the more audiences will become aware of the trickery that goes on behind the scenes to pull this off, but if the cuts are well hidden, then this means the effect is the same. An extended, unbroken, single-perspective look into the world of the film. Scenes or shots like this generally fall into one of two camps. The first would be scenes that are not particularly flashy, and the director is simply letting the camera roll for as long as it needs to, so as to draw the audience into the story and the setting. That isn't to say that these scenes are simple, because they usually require a silly amount of trial and error, planning, improvisation, and precise choreography. Examples of this include the club scene in Goodfellas, the entirety of Boiling Point, the entirety of Season 1, Episode 7 of The Bear, the entirety of Adolescence, the opening and introduction to the characters in 1917, and the opening credits of Baby Driver. The reason we do not cut away from Henry and Karen walking into the nightclub in Goodfellas is so that we can experience what happens in real time, which means Henry is bringing us, as well as Karen, into the apparently glamorous and seductive world of the Mafia. The point of these scenes is immersion, occasionally tension, and to help connect the audience with the direct experiences of the characters in the film. The second type of extended one-shot sequences would be the holy fuck look at this, where the audience is placed into an intense set piece and the intensity is sustained in part due to the fact that the camera never looks away. You have nowhere to hide. You don't even get the feeling of safety from a change in perspective that allows you to disconnect from the events taking place. You are simply watching this happen right in front of you. Examples of this include the opening battle and closing fight scene in The Revenant, the over-the-top scene in 1917, the shootout in True Detective, the opening of Gravity, the fight scene in Creed, the ambush scene in Children of Men, the corridor fight in Old Boy, the chaotic mid-battle shot in Game of Thrones' Battle of the Bastards, and the prison escape in Extraction 2. Immersion is obviously still important here, but these are undeniably flashier than the previous examples. These could cynically be viewed as a marketing gimmick because these kinds of sequences are memorable due to how impressive they are, and this will inevitably lead to positive word of mouth regardless of whether the film is actually any good. Unlike the previous examples, the objective here is partially to sell one or many visual effects. The audience is meant to be like, how the fuck did they do this in camera? These are typically exceedingly difficult and time-consuming sequences to put together, as particularly when you are dealing with fight scenes, weapons, blood effects, and pyrotechnics, the time required to clean up and reset becomes exponentially longer, which means you can subconsciously feel the tension that was there on the day when they were filming it, because if someone misses their cue, this will result in hours or even days before filming can continue. This is like the former, but on crack. This is absolute madmen creating incredibly complex action sequences, in which not only the actors have to follow their choreography, but the cameraman and lighting technicians need to follow them to the letter, and if one person makes a mistake, then everything needs to be reset. An issue that filmmakers can run into, however, is that these kinds of shots have become far more common, which means the average audience member may well notice that the camera has not cut away for 30 seconds or so, which means they may be more perceptive and start actively looking for things that might break the illusion. This scene in Bag End fits into both camps of extended single-shot sequences because it features a very important conversation between Gandalf and Bilbo, but it is also selling a visual effect. This is not anywhere near as intense as some of the scenes I have mentioned, but it is constructed in this way to convince the audience that what we are seeing is real, even though it is not. This happens during a conversation. Although it is an important conversation, this is not typically the kind of place where a filmmaker would dedicate time and effort into constructing a sequence like this. The more obvious choice might be when the audience is being introduced to a new location, such as when we enter Helm's Deep or something. But Peter Jackson saw an opportunity here, as well as in a couple of other key moments that I will get to soon, to really sell the visual effect to the audience. And it is precisely because this happens at an unassuming point in the film that, when compared to the trilogy as a whole, appears to be pretty unremarkable on a technical level, this fully achieves the desired effect. Additionally, because this is a particularly long shot, the moment we finally cut away to something else is given additional meaning. The thing that motivates the cut is that Bilbo takes the ring out of his pocket, and we then cut to a close-up, at which point the scene transitions into a battle of wills between all three participants.
An interesting thing about the scaling of the characters, not only were we working on 3 of the biggest films ever made, but the fact that Tolkien wrote one line, which was that the hobbits were smaller than humans, meant that not only did we have to build everything once, we had to build it a second time, either 1.38 times bigger or 1.38 times smaller, 1.38 being the dividing or multiplying ratio between the size of a human and the size of a 4'2" hobbit. In doing so, we set about having to scale the finest increments of every item. The proportion of everything had to be extremely carefully figured out.
Now I need to talk about what I think is broadly the most impressive visual effect in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but that might be unfairly simplistic, because this isn't one effect. The effect in question is increasing or decreasing the size of the actors.
One of the important things about Lord of the Rings is just the relationship of hobbits to humans, and that all has to do with size. And technically speaking, in terms of the visual effects, is going to be a huge part of selling the visuals of the show.
Hobbits are small. They tend to be about 4 feet tall. 3'6" is kind of the average height of a hobbit. Obviously, we're not that size, so there was an interesting logistical issue with making us that size.
So the key to making these hobbits appear small, as it is in any film, is to use numerous different techniques, which is forced perspective and blue screen and just guys with big suits that look bigger than the hobbits. And what it does, it keeps, you never really focus on one type of effect. You're always kind of looking, shooting over a double, seeing Bilbo and just sticking them on apple crates. And it's that kind of shell game that you play with the different types of effects that I think makes it flawless. You're not always looking at it and saying, "Oh, here's a blue screen digital double."
Most of this relates to the Hobbits, and although the various tricks occur throughout the trilogy, each type of trick is generally seen for the first time during the Shire sequences, But there are a couple of examples from elsewhere that I will mention here to keep things clean. The objective was to seamlessly depict an entire race of people, plus Gimli later in the film, as being about 30 to 40% smaller than the actors who play them. When you are filming a scene entirely consisting of hobbits, then this is relatively simple. All you need to do is give the audience a point of reference, something that we are already familiar with, such as a horse or a pint of beer, for example, to communicate approximately how small they are. Where things get complicated, however, is when the hobbits have to share scenes with non-hobbits, which, unfortunately for the filmmakers, is about 75% of their scenes in The Lord of the Rings. To be successful, this effect needs to be understated, and absolutely under no circumstances should this draw attention to itself. It is not meant to look impressive, it is meant to look real. To help achieve this, Peter Jackson decided that he would not cut corners and take the easy way out by avoiding, where possible, having the smaller characters interacting with the larger characters. He, in fact, did the opposite. He understood that in order to sell the illusion, the characters needed to interact as much as possible. This necessitated numerous techniques to trick the audience into accepting that the hobbits are 3 feet tall. Many of these techniques were complex and time-consuming and yet only appeared on screen for a few seconds, but rather than using these effects as a showpiece or a tech demo, Peter Jackson used them as a tool that allowed him to capture the images he wanted to capture. To accomplish this rather audacious effect throughout the majority of these 11 hours of film, they used every trick in the book. Scale doubles, set doubles, full CG body doubles, CG head replacements, rubber masks, forced perspective with a moving camera, blue screen compositing, small actors piloting giant robot suits, simply putting the actors on their knees. The list goes on. In every single shot, the filmmakers worked out what was needed so as to sell the effect for that particular shot, which meant they had to come up with multiple ways to achieve the desired result. And the result is seamless. We fully accept that Gandalf is twice the height of Bilbo, even though Ian McKellen is only about 6 inches taller than Ian Holm. There were also a few happy accidents that saved the filmmakers some time and allowed for certain scenes to be shot in a slightly more conventional manner, as they had originally assumed that they would need to account for 3 separate scales, one for the hobbits, one for Gimli, and one for everyone else. However, because John Rhys-Davies is 6'1", considerably taller than the Hobbit actors, they were able to film Gimli's scenes alongside the Hobbits, as their heights could be scaled down by the same amount, and they would look correct next to the men and elves. Many tests were done before any actors were involved, because until the filmmakers were able to confidently crack the scale issue, many other departments were on hold. The costume department wouldn't know what costumes would be needed or how many in each size. The cinematographer may not be able to design certain sequences until he knew what would be possible in camera, and the lighting of a scene may change completely if you need to light 2 characters who are completely different sizes.
The complexity of it that we need, because we've got so many shooting units and there are so many doubles, both scale and big rig double. We had 64 Frodo outfits that we would need for the films and 32 Aragorns, and we were up to 133 bags, travel bags, for each of the characters.
Everything that the actors sat on, wore, touched, fought with, and passed through in the environment had to be considered as a scalable issue. You can imagine how difficult it is on intangible things like fabric, where the looms had to be built at different scales so that the fabric weave could be made at different sizes to give the impression of a bigger or smaller cloth.
I was very worried about Baggins because I knew just how small the set was, and once you get 50 or 60 crew members in there, it's going to become very cluttered very quickly and very difficult to work in. And so I wanted just to be able to really get my head into how we would shoot these scenes. And I'd done my little lipstick camera mock-ups with a cardboard model some months earlier, because we were Also trying to figure out ways to shoot the scales too, because we had Gandalf had to be tall, and Bilbo and Frodo happened to be small, and we were starting to get our heads into how we were going to shoot all this stuff. We sort of did a mock-up of the entire scene that we were going to shoot. It turned out to be a relatively accurate, I mean, I think we made script changes eventually, so things altered a bit, but it turned out to be a relatively accurate version of what ultimately was in the film.
The set test for the bag end sequence is particularly funny because of how low-tech it is. Some of the line deliveries during this set test are quite amusing, as a result of the crew not being actors. One highlight is during the scene where Gandalf grabs Sam and interrogates him. This poor man is shit-talked by Joseph Stalin's floating head speaking in an Australian accent.
Samwise Gamgee, you've been eavesdropping. It's a little late to be gardening, Samwise Gamgee.
Before doing these tests as a proof of concept, they did not know if they could use regular-sized actors because when you start playing with forced perspective by positioning an actor further away, this may not look right. It may look like a regular-sized person who has been shrunk, which would have different proportions to a person with dwarfism, which would have different proportions to a child, and so on. Mixing together all of these doubles may not work if they all look like different types of people, and this was potentially quite problematic for hobbits, because hobbit proportions are not identical to small humans. The Hobbit actors, as with much of the cast, wore extensive prosthetics to enlarge certain parts of their physiology, such as their ears, noses, and feet. And the filmmakers needed to figure out if this increased size would need to be exaggerated even more once they shrink the character down by 40%. One good example of forced perspective is when the hobbits arrive at the Prancing Pony and Barlaam Butterbur leans over the counter. The 4 hobbit actors were filmed against an oversized bar, and clever angles made Butterbur appear larger than them. The filmmakers did not just switch the camera on and figure this out on the day. Everything was calculated mathematically because the hobbits had to be a specific size relative to the human-sized characters. A hobbit is about 0.75 times the size of a human, which means the actors needed to be about 30% further away from the camera than the actors playing humans. This means if Gandalf and Frodo are standing next to each other, and you want them to appear as though they are both 5 meters from the camera, Elijah Wood will need to stand about 6.5 meters away from the camera. One benefit of using forced perspective is that it allows the filmmakers to capture as much in camera as possible, which means they could sign it off and be happy with the finished shot without having to pass it through multiple other departments to be tweaked and cleaned up, only to find that it doesn't look right. This means the solutions to the problem of scale were often the simplest ones. Move one character closer to the camera, position them higher up so that they are looking down at the hobbits, position the camera below Gandalf to give the impression that the hobbits are looking up at him. To help achieve this effect, props and sets were built multiple times, and the level of detail here is pretty mind-blowing. They went as far as choosing certain types of wood for the furniture so that the grain would look right at different sizes. Bag End was also built at full size for Ian Holm, and then a duplicate set was constructed at about 70% of the size for Ian McKellen, and they also built a facade of the exterior on location. And whenever we see any shot-reverse shot sequences alternating between the characters as they talk to each other, most likely we are actually seeing the actors on separate sets and they are not in the same room.
So every time that you're seeing Ian Holm, you're looking at a Bag End which is large, which makes him look like he's the right size. And when you look at Ian McKellen, you're seeing a much smaller Bag End, one in which we all had to bend over and stoop as we went in the door, and we just simply, they were exactly the same. The books on the shelves were built to different scales, the candles, the candlesticks, the furniture was all manufactured at 2 different sizes. They're exact replicas of each other, except one of them is 33% smaller than the other. Of course, once Gandalf walks inside Bag End, then you're into a studio. You're no longer at Matamata, you're several hundred miles away and you're in a small confined studio.
In the smaller one, I, as a normal-sized person, could look enormous because everything in Bag End was small.
If you have 2 people of the same height and you want to make one of them look smaller, you simply take that person further away from the camera. So suddenly the camera is seeing somebody close at a certain height and somebody further away at a smaller height.
There's still
a sort of wonderful immediacy about forced perspective process because you got it all on the camera.
Pete was able to select which shot to do and where so that he could, get a lot of practical footage of the actors really bumping their heads, really being in that confined space and environment and whatnot. Which set you shot in would really depend upon who is spending the most time interacting with that environment. If you see Bilbo taking a lot of books off the shelves and moving around and doing a lot of stuff, it's probably usually shot in Big Bag and with Bilbo and his environment, and then shooting Gandalf separately against a blue screen. But if Gandalf was interacting more with his environment, then we shoot that in the small one.
One particularly effective example of forced perspective being used in a somewhat unconventional manner is when Frodo and Gandalf are riding on the cart. The filmmakers used 3 different carts. One was a normal cart, and this was used in combination with scale doubles. One was oversized for use with Elijah Wood, and the other was a forced perspective gag built into the cart itself. It was constructed so as to position Elijah Wood a specific distance away from Ian McKellen, whilst accounting for the camera position as the camera was attached to the cart itself, which then meant that both actors could be filmed in a way that shows both of their faces. The reason they did this was likely because compositing 2 separate takes on a horse and cart as it moves through the extensive Hobbiton location would have either been impossible or exceedingly difficult, and so they instead solved the problem by changing the cart itself. One limitation of traditional forced perspective shots is that you can't move the camera, because as soon as you do this, the perspective changes and so the illusion is broken. You can see that Ian Holm is just standing further away from Ian McKellen, and he is not actually 3 feet tall. The filmmakers, however, wanted to be able to film certain scenes with a free camera whilst having both actors on set at the same time, as static camera shots are not always appropriate, and had they been used inappropriately, then it would have potentially caused the viewer to realize that the film is arbitrarily limiting itself to sell a particular visual effect. By working out a way of moving the camera for certain scenes whilst maintaining the forced perspective illusion, the filmmakers managed to further immerse the audience into the world of the film, because now we have a camera moving through the scene, and yet somehow Ian Holm is still 3 feet tall. This was accomplished using a combination of camera work, set design, and automated motion control, and it involved putting parts of the set, including the actors, on rails that would move around relative to the position of the camera. Because these movements are matched perfectly using computers, the end result is that the actor on rails appears to be static whilst the camera moves around them, even though, in actuality, he is sliding either closer to or further away from the camera.
You do a motion control move where you have the one actor on a moving platform. So when the camera moves, you're doing your moves all relative. So you're literally sliding the guy along on the floor as your motion control camera is moving along. When you're actually viewing it, you're basically doing a split. And if you're doing a move around, when you do this split, it looks like they're moving in sync with each other. And it's because you're moving the 2 guys around relative to this moving camera.
One particularly impressive example of this is in what would have ordinarily been a mundane shot of Bilbo pouring Gandalf a cup of tea. You would usually just have Ian Holm walk up to the table and pour the tea. But because Bilbo is 3 feet tall, you can't do that. One option would be to use compositing. Film both actors separately with one against a blue screen and then combine the footage later. But one downside to this is that having the characters interact with each other becomes incredibly challenging. This shot could have been simplified and accomplished via compositing, but the objective of the filmmakers was to convince the audience that Bilbo Baggins is 3 feet tall. So instead of taking the relatively easy way out by having Ian Holm take the lid off the teapot and pour the water himself, and later compositing this shot with an entirely separate shot of Ian McKellen on the smaller set, the filmmakers saw this as an opportunity to trick the audience. The entire reason why this table gag was necessary is because the filmmakers wanted Gandalf to take the lid off the teapot, not Bilbo. Which means Ian McKellen had to interact with the teapot before Ian Holm did. This shot goes on for more than 20 seconds, during which the actors needed to interact with each other. Bilbo moves around the room, Gandalf rotates as he does so, and they exchange dialogue. Both characters are interacting with the same table, and although Bilbo doesn't touch it, he is standing close and leaning over it, and even though the shot cuts before he pours anything into the teapot, the framing of this shot would make using blue screen compositing very difficult, as it would require Ian Holm to act out this 20-second sequence in isolation with no Gandalf, and almost certainly with no table. Bilbo's "oh thank you" when Gandalf takes the lid off the teapot is the cherry on top that makes the moment feel natural and spontaneous.
Oh, thank you.
Totally concealing the fact that the actors are actually standing a couple of meters away from each other. They are not looking directly at each other. The table is in fact a Franken table covered in props of different sizes, and Gandalf is in fact sitting on a computerized wheelie chair that is sliding him around as the camera moves.
So coming up is one of the first force perspective slave motion control base moves that we did. It's shot in Big Bag End so that Bilbo looks the correct size to all his environment that he's walking around in the background. But in the foreground, Ian McKellen, playing Gandalf, is sitting at a small table on a little motion control mover that keeps his table in line with the larger table that's a few feet behind him further back. It's the larger table in the background that Bilbo is pouring tea and interacting with, and the smaller one in the foreground is what Ian McKellen's doing. So in terms of like the teapot here, he's actually setting his small prop lid right in front of him on a little rod that from camera looks like it's lined up and sitting on the larger pot that Bilbo is pouring tea into in the background.
Force perspective's been done for years, of course, but this is the first time I think it's been done where they did moving force perspective. It's usually a lockdown camera on a nodal head, and now you've got one Ian closer to the camera with a table piece that is closer to the camera, and then the other Ian farther away with a bigger table piece. They line up, except when the Ian in the foreground gently bumps the table with his knee.
The beginning of the shot where Ian's turning in to stick his legs under the table, and if you watch the first foreground half of the table, you'll see it move in relation to the back half, which is, 5 to 10 feet away, sort of in the background there.
Right, but you didn't hear that from us.
The shot ends before Bilbo pours any water into the teapot. However, this same set and technique is used in a later scene with Frodo, in which he does fully interact with the teapot. And so in that later scene, the teapot has been replaced with a larger prop because it is further away. Which means, in this first scene, we have Gandalf interacting with a small teapot lid close to the camera, with Bilbo and the rest of the teapot further away from the camera. And in the second scene, we have Gandalf close to the camera, with Frodo and a large teapot further away. And in both scenes, Gandalf is on rails and moves slightly closer to the camera as it moves away from him. The end result is that Gandalf is portrayed as much larger than either of the hobbits, and the teapot is always size appropriate for a hobbit, regardless of where it is relative to the camera.
I've got a look there.
For when he's standing?
Yeah, but I don't, and I got a look there for when Nigel's sitting. What I don't have is a look when he's crouching, which is the beginning of the shot.
Okay, we can give you that. We can go back to number ones and make sure that you've got that. We'll look at the eyes. Elijah will be roughly down here. He's not directly opposite you. He's a bit lower, a bit further down the table. He's over here.
But also logistically for us as actors, that posed the problem of eyeline.
From the hand of Sauron himself. No, don't look at me. Sauron himself.
Because we couldn't look at each other during the two shots, which is a weird thing because you rely so much on the other actor's eyes when you're acting. It's important to have that connection, and we didn't have that connection for those kind of shots.
Actors rely hugely on each other to deliver their performances, and so playing scenes like this in which you are not allowed to look at the other actor was a challenge for everyone involved. Because the actors had to look at where the other character would appear to be standing once the forced perspective trick had done its magic. The height and direction would be incorrect, which means although it appears that Gandalf is looking at Bilbo, he is actually looking at a mark that is closer to the camera than Ian Holm.
There's a scene with Gandalf and Frodo in Bag End when Frodo gets up from the table and says, we'll hide the ring and no one will ever find it. And suddenly I had to kind of remember my marks, hit a mark at a specific place at a specific time so that it matched the timing of the shot that they got with Ian.
We shoot each actor separately and then later, the two pieces of film, put them back together again and composite them into one.
We use blue screen photography so that you could do a pass on one actor with the camera closer to him, and the smaller actor, you could repeat that pass with the camera further away again against the blue screen, and then composite those two images together, or you could shrink one image down in the computer and composite it together.
Scale compositing was used for scenes in which the actors did not need to interact with each other in any kind of tightly choreographed manner, which means timing was less of a concern. This would generally be accomplished by filming the larger character perform the movement on their own with the camera closer to them, and then repeating this with the smaller character and the camera further away. These two separate bits of footage would then be combined into one single shot, giving the illusion that these two characters occupied the same scene when they were in fact filmed separately. One example of this is when the Fellowship is first formed, and the reason compositing was chosen was likely because this is a static shot in which everyone just stands there as Elrond speaks to them, and they do not need to interact with each other. It would be inappropriate to use scale doubles because we need to see the characters' faces in detail during this important moment, and you can't do forced perspective due to the framing because the larger characters needed to stand behind the smaller ones. Another particularly difficult shot to get right was when Gandalf first entered Bag End, and what Peter Jackson chose to do here was, again, arguably unnecessary, but he saw this as an opportunity and a challenge rather than something that should be avoided.
Now, some of the scale tricks in the film were done with very complicated methods, and I wanted to really spend a lot of time on the shot here where Ian McKellen and Ian Holm are together in the hallway. And we shot them separately. Ian McKellen was against blue screen, and the hat handover with the stick was the most tricky part of the shot, which was basically involving a different size hats, different size sticks, and blending the two together with a computer. It was just a situation where if we did a few of these complicated shots, time-consuming, difficult shots, I thought it would sell the concept of scale for the rest of the film.
How did they pass those off? They're two separate actors filmed separately.
So the way they actually shot this is they shot this with Bilbo Baggins on set, the real full-size set that they built, with just a stand-in for Gandalf. The Gandalf you see here is not in the original plate.
Blue screen Gandalf. They have exactly matched the lighting of this Hobbit hole on their blue screen set. Like the sunlight from when he steps in to like that soft glow from like the left side and the ground. All the lighting is perfectly matched.
Not only are they in the shot together,
they interact.
They interact. Look at that, he grabs the hat from him.
There's a very subtle and genius thing that they're doing here. He passes his staff to his other hand, which is then behind his body. So the moment his elbow is behind his body, you just have a forearm, and they can cut that out and reposition that however they want. And that's what they do right there. See how it settles down? So right there, now it's a cutout arm. Have the hat now cut out.
Watch the tip of the hat. It actually distorts into place.
Yep, right there. And you no longer see his fingers or his arm or anything interacting with it. It can just literally be an image that's cut out and then moved to the right spot.
This functions almost as a magic trick because we are presented with this gigantic man inside Bag End, and whilst our brains are distracted by his size, Bilbo just slides in and takes his hat and staff and carries them away. They do not draw attention to the fact that Bilbo has taken the hat and staff from Gandalf. This is simply Bilbo being an accommodating host, and because this is all contained within one shot, the end result is seamless interaction between two characters who were actually filmed separately. Probably the strangest method the film uses is the so-called big rigs, which are used quite rarely, and they are essentially small actors piloting giant robot suits. Although they appear simple, cumbersome, and intended only to be seen from a distance, they are deceptively complex, even featuring functioning robot hands. The hands are seen maybe once or twice, but having the freedom to move the fingers on these robot suits meant that the effect would never be questioned, as it would be if the hands were simply giant static rubber gloves. Again, Peter Jackson could have just skipped this and only shown the hobbits next to the humans when he absolutely had to. But he went out of his way to reiterate that they are much shorter than the big folk. This is why when the hobbits are at the Prancing Pony, one of these big rigs walks between the four hobbits. This is simply a guy leaving the pub and he is narratively irrelevant to the film. So if Peter Jackson wanted to cut corners, he could just not have this guy leave the pub. but by including it, this feels honest and real. The film is not hiding anything, the effect is just out in the open, and this is what life is like in Bree.
A very sophisticated stilt walking technique that Richard Taylor's group devised, so that you could put people into these big rig things and would extend their legs, and they had oversized costumes made and remote controlled hands that were twice normal size.
The films also make extensive use of scale doubles, either by pairing human-sized characters with actors and stunt people with dwarfism, or by pairing the Hobbit actors with people who were over 7 feet tall.
We did a worldwide search for people that were actually, I think, about 4 feet tall, and found a number of very good people that have actually acted.
One of our doubles who is over 7 feet tall and huge and but perfectly proportioned.
Paul is sitting at this moment in one of the oversized boats. We call him Tall Paul, which is sort of redundant because if you know him, you know how tall he is. He's 7'2", and he's doubling Aragorn.
This was a very important scene because it's the first time we see the size of hobbits compared to a human, or in this case, a wizard, Gandalf.
Which actor or double would appear in any given shot would vary entirely depending on the specific needs of that shot, and this would often alternate depending on how far away the camera is. For example, when Frodo first meets Gandalf, the close-ups are obviously all Elijah Wood. Any shots where Frodo is facing away from the camera is his scale double Kieran Shah in a wig. Frodo Baggins, however, is not Kieran Shah's magnum opus, as he went on to do the motion capture for the best character in The Hobbit, Wheelie Boy. Anyway, the shot of Frodo jumping onto the cart is Kieran Shah wearing a rubber mask of Elijah Wood's face. The shots focusing on Gandalf hugging Frodo are Ian McKellen hugging Kieran Shah. The shots focusing on Frodo hugging Gandalf are Elijah Wood hugging Gandalf's scale double. And we then transition into the forced perspective cart gag in which Elijah Wood is sitting further away from the camera to make him look smaller than Ian McKellen. Small people were used to play the hobbits in most shots that were not focused on the characters' faces.
There were 4 scale doubles engaged for the duration of the film, 4 small ones and a couple of big ones. So if you're seeing Frodo's face and actions, ideally you would be seeing Gandalf's back, unless it's a forced perspective shot.
If they were facing away from the camera, then the scale doubles would simply wear the costume and a wig, and that is all that would be needed. But if they were facing the camera, then they would wear rubber masks modelled after the actors. Generally, the scale doubles were only used in shots that did not require that we see the character's face, or where the face is either obscured or unimportant. But there are a couple of key scenes in the film that required the use of a scale double, but also needed the performance of the actor to come through. Examples of this include Merry and Pippin being taken away by the Uruk-hai, and Frodo being carried by Boromir after Gandalf falls in Moria. Both of these were critical and emotionally loaded moments that necessitated a larger character picking up and carrying a smaller character. If you want the wide shot of the Hobbit being picked up by a larger person, you can immediately rule out compositing, forced perspective, and big rigs, which means your only option is to film a regular-sized person picking up a small person. But because the filmmakers needed the performance of the actors to come through, they decided to use computers to add the footage of the actor's face on top of the scale double, which is essentially compositing but on a much more granular level.
A lot of the basic techniques that we're doing have been around in one form or another for a long time. And it's just a matter of, the tools are there. How are you going to use the tools for your situation?
What I love is that we employed every trick from absolute latest state-of-the-art digital technology to, rubber bands, chewing gum, whatever you could drag out of a hat.
The whole shot is a moment in a scene where you're just reinforcing on the audience this whole idea of scale in just a slightly gratuitous way, making people go, oh, cool, wow, how did they do that?
I think Pete does exactly what Tolkien does. He mentions that the hobbits are very small, and then he forgets about it for chapter and chapter and chapter, and then it'll come in again, and you don't have to make a big thing of it. And then you do shots like that every now and again just to remind the audience, and then the rest is the audience imagination.
Our principal Hobbiton set was in a farm near the town of Matamata, and we shot a lot of the location footage there.
It was there, it was real, it was as we'd have imagined it. Bag End was there with the massive tree sticking out of the top, coming down, as we'd seen it in various paintings and images before. It was exactly how we'd imagined it.
Hobbiton was an exceptional location, except that it was extremely difficult to access. All the roads were really paths. It was a very fragile landscape, and yet we basically still had to come in with fairly sizable technology. It just required more physical labour to actually work the location.
The style of Hobbiton was first and foremost to be homely and familiar. So it has a kind of an Englishness to it that I think Tolkien would have liked us to use.
The Hobbiton location took about a year to construct, and the filmmakers describe it as a set that was grown rather than built. They understood that even though we don't spend a huge amount of time in Hobbiton, and most of the time we do spend there is inside Bag End, which was a separate set hundreds of miles away, it was absolutely critical to the stakes and the setting that Hobbiton felt real.
I just couldn't imagine we'd find Hobbiton intact as we found it in the backside of a big plot of farmland in the North Island.
They decided to let the plants grow for a year so that the place looked lived in and integrated with nature, rather than like somewhere that didn't exist until the cameras started rolling.
It's got to have long grass, it's got to look as though the grass has been there forever, it's got to have fruit trees with fruit on them, it's got to have hedges with leaves on them. It's a big place. How much lead-in time do you think you need to make it look as though it's always been there? Well, a year would be good. Okay, yeah, I think we could do a year, and so we started planning from a very early age with Hobbiton that we would begin construction a year out from filming.
We spent at least a year before we were due to shoot in building Hobbiton. The bridge is completely fabricated. It was built by the New Zealand Army out of polystyrene. The Green Dragon pub was just constructed inside of a small lake.
Nowadays, you would probably just CG in a load of plants. Let's be honest, basically all of this would be done in a computer now. But this technology was not really an option back then, or at least not on the scale that would have been necessary. Another option would be to artificially weather the plants to make them look older, but this would never look quite the same as allowing the plants to naturally fill up the space.
Our greens department were there a year before we started filming, and they bought hedgerows from the other farms around there because it didn't have hedgerows on this farm. And they're all holly, which is another noxious weed in New Zealand. So the farmer wanted them out of there after we had finished with them. But we wanted to get them in gone early because we wanted to get the grass growing up through them, so it made it look as though they weren't newly put there. And in fact, there was a very strict sequence of planting events that had to happen through the year. And then towards the end of the set-making sequence, we had to be very careful about when we allowed grass cutting to happen, because we wanted the grass to look long and sort of full, because the scale of the whole Hobbit thing wanted to look like the grass and the trees and all that sort of stuff were a larger scale, so we chose grass types for that. And we let the grass grow very, very long, and then we had to get sheep in to sort of get it grazed down to a natural look, but then let the grass grow again beyond that up to a point when the crew would arrive. So we were being very careful about counting down the days about when we trimmed it back and when we let things grow, and of course when various plant types were going to come into fruit and come into flower and all that sort of stuff.
Since it was the opening of the film, we basically wanted to start off with sort of a very idyllic place, which is very expressive of a simple lifestyle, a rural lifestyle, where people are actually very much in touch with nature. And I just wanted to make everyone feel like that it was like a holiday destination. People would love to want to go there.
Depicting the Hobbit's love of nature in this much detail and with this level of focus helps to contrast them specifically with Saruman. Had Saruman just been like, yeah, trees suck, bring them all down, then this would have clearly shown that he wants to exploit nature for his own ends, and that he doesn't care at all about preserving the natural beauty of Middle-earth. But because we understand just how much the Hobbits respect nature, this then means that Saruman's actions are an affront to the Hobbits themselves, which makes his antagonism more personal. Excluding the cutaways to Bilbo, it takes nearly 3 minutes of travel time that we see on screen for Gandalf to travel from where he meets Frodo to Bag End. And whilst I am sure that trimming this sequence down and hard cutting from Gandalf meeting Frodo straight to Gandalf arriving at Bag End would have been at least considered in the name of streamlining the film, had this been done, we would have lost so much incidental world building, even had the explicit world building been moved elsewhere. By simply watching Frodo and Gandalf travel through Hobbiton, even if we put the film on mute, we get to see the scale of the location, the population, their behavior, their customs, and how Gandalf does or does not fit in with these customs. We can see that the hobbits have a deep respect for nature, and their houses are quite literally integrated with nature instead of replacing it, as they are built into the ground, thus allowing the natural world to pretty much ignore them.
And so much of it was designed with an idea of comfort in mind, but not just, physical comfort and well-being and coziness and warmth, but also a sort of artistic warmth in that you draw upon a fairly sophisticated set of cultural references, but bring them down in scale and round them off a little bit and make them a little more homey and a little warmer. It's basically trying to recreate a sort of England that probably never really existed. You could imagine our collective cultural childhood in a historical sense, and that would be personified by Bag End and Hobbiton. I've never really been to England. I've been to London countless times, but London is a place where you go and jump off a plane and get in a taxi and run and see people and jump back in a taxi and get a plane again. So the England that I was trying to recreate is one I've never really seen. So it's an England of Paradise Lost in that sense, sort of an idealized continental England that you'd like to imagine existed.
I loved this Bag End set so much. It felt so comfortable that when we finished shooting with it, it was due to be destroyed, as all of our sets are. They basically get broken up and junked when the filming's finished, and I couldn't bear that to happen to Bag End, so I approached New Line and I said, if I can pay for my own storage, can I keep the Bag End set? And they agreed. So I've got Bag End in storage, and one day I'm going to put it into the side of the hill.
Peter Jackson then ended up using the bits he kept to help reconstruct the set when they came back to film The Hobbit, and this has now become a permanent tourist attraction in New Zealand. The final part of the visuals that I would like to touch on here is the way they used digital color grading, but before I do, quick history lesson. Before color grading, filmmakers used a process called color timing. Color timing was a chemical process that involved the film negative being physically adjusted by being exposed to different colors. This process is not easily reversible because as soon as you make chemical alterations to the film negative, you have quite literally changed its physical properties, so you can't simply press Ctrl-Z and start again. This meant filmmakers had to plan far ahead, to the degree where scenes would be lit in a particular way or costumes would be dyed in slightly the wrong color so that they would look right after the film was graded. Color timing is still used today, although it is far less common due to the limitations. One director who still heavily uses photochemical color timing is Christopher Nolan, because that madman pretty much does whatever he wants. The first film to use digital color grading was Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which was released in 2000, but there was a trilogy of films released around that time that is rather notorious for its color grading, and this is something that was adjusted multiple times post-release due to advances in technology. When The Matrix was released in 1999, digital grading was not yet widespread. The theatrical release of The Matrix still had a subtle green tint, but this was accomplished largely through practical means, including using chemicals to adjust the overall color balance after the film was finished. You may be familiar with the term bleach bypass, which was common at the time and is still used today. And this process involves an alteration to the conventional bleaching stage of processing a film, resulting in less saturated colors and a more noticeable film grain. Aside from The Matrix, this technique was also used in Saving Private Ryan, Seven, and Fight Club, amongst many others. However, the version of The Matrix that you are familiar with is almost certainly not the original theatrical release. In the subsequent 2004 DVD and 2008 Blu-ray releases, the film was digitally regraded so as to make it look more like the sequels that were digitally graded for their original releases, and this resulted in the infamous acid green colorization that the films are known for. This was again changed for the 4K Ultra HD remaster in 2018, where the film was again regraded so that the green tint was only applied in scenes set inside the Matrix, whilst the real-world scenes were given the blue tint that they had in the theatrical release. Much like the Matrix trilogy, the Lord of the Rings trilogy also changed its colouring process as a result of technological advancements. The Fellowship of the Ring used a combination of colour timing and digital colour grading, whilst The Two Towers and The Return of the King did not use colour timing, and they were entirely graded digitally.
Digital grading is basically taking, once you've filmed a negative and you have a negative image, you then scan it on a scanning machine into a digital format, which means you can now put it on a monitor and you can manipulate the image with a huge variety of tools. You can make it brighter and darker, you can affect the colours, you can affect highlights and shadows, and you can isolate some parts of the image, and you can basically manipulate the image in just about any conceivable way, and then you scan the footage back out onto negative. So what you end up with is that you started with a 35mm negative, then you finish on a 35mm negative, but you've been able to sort of influence the image in between.
The Fellowship of the Ring was the first blockbuster to use digital colour grading to this degree, and it had never been done with this level of granularity before. Digital colour grading is not really the same as colour correction, although colour correction is usually a part of the process. Digital colour grading was employed primarily for two purposes in The Lord of the Rings. One was to make small changes for coherency and readability. So, for example, adjusting the light on a character's face, or helping to stitch two shots together that were filmed under entirely different conditions. The Lord of the Rings was not filmed in a tightly controlled, sterile environment. It was instead filmed out of chronological order over a 14-month period in numerous locations and weather conditions. Peter Jackson's tendency to do pickups after the film had been partially edited meant that they would occasionally be putting scenes filmed years apart right next to each other.
It's one of the things that took a long time for me to get used to the idea of having trust and faith in, was Peter's complete confidence that a shot inside the set here and just a quick reverse that's actually outside in Hamilton, where you see, this shot was done maybe 5 months later than the shot two shots previous.
The vast array of types of shots in the film meant that it risked feeling disjointed. Some scenes were filmed on location, some were filmed in a studio, some shots are full CG, many are composites as a result of the techniques used to convey scale, and plenty of these shots include miniatures, and so digital grading was used to help make everything feel consistent.
The push for digital grading was twofold. One is straight up pragmatism. It's multiple cameras across many months of shooting with quite unpredictable weather. And so you would have a situation where it is a dialogue scene and you would be intercutting between 3 or 4 cameras spread across a period of like 6 months. So digital was a tool that could basically just bring consistency to that, and to help take a little bit of the pressure off being able to shoot without a filter and get another half hour of daylight at the end, knowing that digital can just kind of pull it back in, knowing that it's a handheld shot and the focus just didn't quite get there. The actor just moved their mark slightly different, and it's a fast shoot, and that's the performance that has to be used to just know that we can get in there and just sharpen just that little bit, just all sorts of like little just technical things that just enhance and just help, the process.
The second objective was to enhance the film by disconnecting it from reality in a stylized way. This is not meant to look like New Zealand, this is meant to look like Middle Earth. Grading was also used in a more granular form to adjust the appearance of the elven characters so as to distinguish them from the various mortal races, and it allowed for the filmmakers to further distinguish between locations by emphasizing the various color palettes of the Shire, Rivendell, and Moria.
Even though the movie was shot on some amazing locations, I wanted to somehow just shift it
nudge it sideways from reality. New Zealand has got all this amazing landscape, which we obviously use to maximum effect, but nonetheless, it's still New Zealand. It's still a real country, a real landscape, and I wanted just to nudge it slightly into Middle-earth, which is an ancient world of 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, a world of myth.
This creates a heightened, almost fairy tale hyper-reality. The greens are greener, the blues are bluer, and regardless of which version of the film you are looking at, the graded version is obviously better to look at than the raw, ungraded footage. However, you can go too far with this technology, and this is why the Shire scenes in the Hobbit trilogy look like an oversaturated neon nightmare when compared to the Shire scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring.
So we got the classic reveal of Hobbiton. We didn't set out to do that much to the shot. Even though it's Hobbiton, you would expect that you would actually want to add green, but what we've found to give a really warm kind of feel to it is we in fact take green out. A little bit of magenta tends to permeate in, which then sends some of the greys slightly magenta, as you can just see coming in there. And then what we do is take those magentas and then sort of swing it into a gold world. And as you can see, it starts to put more of a spread into the grass. You know, you can just see the different sort of layers happening there, and gives that kind of the warm feel that is sort of Hobbiton.
As has become common, for better or worse, there are multiple versions of the Lord of the Rings trilogy because it has been re-released multiple times. As you might expect, these releases are not identical, nor are they simply upgrades in the sense of them being upscaled to 4K. There are very noticeable stylistic differences between the different versions, and a large part of this is as a result of the films being regraded. This was done both because Peter Jackson wished to give the trilogy more consistency with itself, but also with the Hobbit trilogy. The DVD release in 2002, the Blu-ray release in 2011, and the 4K Ultra HD remaster in 2020 all look noticeably different. And to make things even more confusing, there are even differences between the theatrical and extended versions of each of these releases. These changes are difficult to compare directly, however, because it's not like they just put a single filter on each and left it switched on for the entire film. The changes become more or less obvious depending on the scene in question. The 2002 DVD generally has very warm colors, and it seems to strike a good balance between realism and hyper-realism. The 2011 Blu-ray theatrical edition is very similar, but it has more aggressive color correction in certain scenes. The 2011 Blu-ray Extended Edition, however, is completely different. It is more saturated, it has some aggressive green and blue tints, it is much darker in places, and it seems to lean the hardest into the fairy tale aesthetic. For some reason, only the Blu-ray Extended Edition of The Fellowship of the Ring is like this, and the later films do not suffer from this rather exaggerated recoloring. The 2020 4K Ultra HD remaster is occasionally far more saturated with a more obvious tint. However, in other scenes, the color changes from the Blu-ray have been reverted back to the styling of the DVD. There also appears to be more of a contrast between the different locations, and in some scenes, the 4K release definitely looks the most naturalistic. Whilst the 4K release obviously has the highest fidelity, the fact that it was upscaled to 4K means that some of the visual effects now seem dated. It occasionally feels too crisp because it removes the natural film grain that can help to hide lower fidelity effects and blend them in with the surrounding footage. Which version is better is largely down to personal preference. The 2011 Blu-ray theatrical edition seems to be the most consistent, but in many scenes the 4K is obviously the best. The exaggerated stylization of the 2011 Blu-ray Extended Edition is definitely not for everyone, and in some scenes I think they may have gone too far. If I had to pick one, then it would be the 2011 Blu-ray theatrical edition, whilst the worst is probably the 2011 Blu-ray Extended Edition. Which actually means that, rather irritatingly, what is in my view the single best film out of the trilogy, and my favourite film of all time, which is the Extended Edition of The Fellowship of the Ring, actually has the worst colour grading of all 6. The Shire section of the Fellowship of the Ring is exceptional, much like the rest of the movie. It is not big and dramatic. It is not particularly fast-paced. It takes its time. It establishes the setting and the characters, sets up the stakes for the story, builds tension and drama, and it does not at any point drag or become boring. Every shot and every line of dialogue is deliberate and has been carefully thought through. The Shire sequence is also a technical masterclass of filmmaking, despite being probably the least flashy part of the film, as everything appears at first glance to be relatively simple. There are numerous changes between the extended and theatrical editions, and both are at times very different to the book. But the filmmakers understood what would work and what would not. Which is why, although the films waver in how accurate they are to the books, and because the filmmakers prioritized making the best movie that they could possibly make, rather than trying to create a one-to-one adaptation of the book, the end result is a phenomenal, once-in-a-lifetime trilogy of movies. I have begun to make a plan for future installments in this series by splitting the Fellowship of the Ring into chunks that I would like to cover in each video. Part 1 being the prologue, and Part 2 being the Shire. The rest may change depending on my schedule as well as how long the videos end up being, and there are certain scenes where I'm going to have a disproportionate amount to talk about, such as the Council of Elrond and Balin's tomb. But I am broadly considering Part 3 covering the journey to Bree, Weathertop, and the flight to the Ford. Part 4 will likely cover everything in Rivendell. Part 5 will likely cover the Pass of Caradhras and everything in Moria, but again, fitting everything in Moria into one video is probably optimistic. Part 6 would then cover everything in Lothlorien, and Part 7 would cover the Great River, Amon Hen, and the breaking of the Fellowship. If you would like to see those videos, please drop me a like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you have not already, because, as I'm sure you can appreciate, these videos take a huge amount of time and research to put together, and I would very much like to be able to continue making them. In the video description, you will find links to my second channel, where I upload various extra bits including music, tier lists, video game streams, and recently a 30-minute supercut of my tortured experience playing Tales of the Shire. That hit the spot? Right, okay, the transaction is nearly complete because I've fed him, which means he now has to give me something. Do you have something for me? She said with a threatening aura. Yes, I do, a rich rhubarb pie. Wait, you had one this whole time? Why did you watch me cook you a rhubarb pie? Hello, Biggie. What are you doing here? So I've just found your cow that you told me to find, and it's standing right there, and your first question to me is, what are you doing here? Where was she? Where you inexplicably didn't go? Oh, no, don't. You're staying here. I know what I can do. Oh, hee hee, ha ha. You're staying right there. You cannot leave. Why are you pathing into the bedroom? Where are you going? Are you going to phase through the wall? You will also find links to my Discord server and my Patreon. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.